LoveLore Library. Chapter 463. Yaoji smiled. Since that is the case, I will join in the fun. Princess, please. The arena was placed on the street opposite the concentrated fragrance court. Yili walked over and saw a dagger embedded with gems in the middle of the arena from afar. If the opponent did not have great confidence in his archery skills, then he must be rich and have no place to spend it. Let's not talk about the dagger, just the hilt and the scabbard were embedded with rubies, sapphires and emeralds. Just the gems on the scabbard were priceless. Qin Feng. Yili said softly. Qin Feng, who was following behind her, came forward and said softly, Princess, what are your orders? Yili looked at the middle-aged man in the northern tribe's uniform and said, investigate this person's background. Qin Feng looked at the man on the arena and nodded, yes, Princess. The three of them stood at the back of the crowd. Yunting had already jumped onto the arena and looked arrogantly at the northern tribesman. Tell me, how do we fight in this arena? The northern tribesman sized up Yunting and laughed. This young master is so fair and clean. Do you want to fight in the arena? Don't be unable to draw your bow. Our northern tribe's bow cannot be compared to your Dechu states. Yunting laughed coldly and said, if I don't want to fight, then why am I here? To fight with you. Walking to the place where the bows and arrows were placed, he casually picked up a bow and an arrow. With a backhand, he shot an arrow towards a thick pillar at the side of the ring. With a hissing sound, the arrow nailed into the pillar and sank into the wood. The spectators below the stage cheered loudly. The northern tribesman also clapped and laughed. Good, I did not expect this young master to be an expert. Since that is the case, let's begin. Yunting snorted and looked down at the bow in his hand, ignoring the other party. The northern tribesman did not mind and laughed. The rules are simple. This humble one has heard that there is a saying in the Central Plains called a sharpshooter from 100 paces. We, the northern tribes, do not like those elegant things. Forget about shooting a willow leaf from 100 paces away. Young master, please look over there. Following the direction of his finger, there was a towering tree about 70 to 80 steps away from the arena. At this moment, there were countless threads hanging down from the numbers on the tree, and at the end of each thread was a copper coin. It was already night time. Even though the streets were lit up like daytime, it was still not as bright as daytime. If one didn't look carefully, they wouldn't even be able to see the strings that held the coins. The copper coin swayed in the cool breeze, occasionally producing a crisp sound. The man said, there are a total of 30 copper coins on it. As long as young master shoots all of them down, this saber will be young master's. You only have half an incense's time, 10 arrows. In other words, he had to use 10 arrows to shoot down 30 copper coins. Yunting. Qinyun frowned. In terms of archery, he was not inferior to Yunting, but to him, it was impossible to shoot down 30 copper coins with 10 arrows. These copper coins were hung at different heights, and it was easy to imagine how difficult it would be to shoot down a few of them at the same time. Compared to the so-called shooting a willow leaf from 100 steps away, this was much more difficult. Yunting stared at the tree for a while, then snorted and shot an arrow. Under the watchful eyes of the crowd, the arrow left the bowstring and shot towards the copper coins under the shade of the tree. With a few crisp sounds, one of the copper coins was pierced through the middle. The huge force of the arrow caused the copper coin to shatter into pieces and fall to the ground. The arrow did not stop there, and shot through another thread that held the copper coin before piercing into the tree. Good. The spectators below the stage could not help but cheer. To be able to shoot two in such a dark night, his archery skills were definitely not inferior to the so-called shooting a willow leaf from 100 steps away. The man from the northern tribe standing on the stage did not show any surprise. Yunting and Qin Yun on the stage did not say anything. Those who knew archery understood that the further one shot, the harder it was to shoot. Yunting's archery skills were not bad, but he might not be able to shoot all 30 copper coins. Seeing Yunting knocked his arrow and aimed again, everyone's eyes were fixed on the copper coins under the tree. When Yunting shot his 7th arrow, there were still 15 copper coins left on the tree. Qin Feng silently appeared behind Yili, giving Yili a shock. Yili turned her head to look at Qin Feng. Qin Feng said in a low voice, "This middle-aged man is indeed from the northern tribes, but he is not an ordinary one. He is a capable general under Helian Jin of the northern tribes. He is also known as the #1 archer of the northern tribes. Furthermore, the dao that he is using as a prize is not simple. It was given to him by the king of the northern tribes when Helian Jin was still favored. It is said that it can cut through hair with a single blow and is incomparably sharp." "Oh." Yili raised her eyebrows and said with a smile, "The #1 archer of the northern tribes has come to Ruyang to set up a stall." Qin Feng smiled and said, "Him setting up a stall has nothing to do with the king of the northern tribes. Ever since Helianjin fell out of favor with the king of the northern tribes, although there were a few factions that wanted to rope him in, they were all rejected by him. He even gave up his original position in the army. Therefore, he is now just a commoner. As long as he does not violate the laws of the various countries, no one can control where he sets up his stall." Because the crown prince had just been born, when Ruyang City sent out invitations, it had already announced that people from all over the world were welcome to come to the northwest for business or sightseeing. Therefore, these days there were many martial arts experts, Jianghu tourists, and even scholars and poets who set up a competition. Of course, there were even more merchants and tourists who came after hearing the news. Yili turned her head to look at him and asked with a smile, "So he is one of Yelu Ye's men?" Qin Feng nodded and said, "You can say that." Yili laughed coldly, "What a good Yelu Yi, and also the 7th prince of the northern tribes." Yelu Yi clearly knew that Ruyang was where the Mahist army and Black Cloud cavalry were stationed, but he still sent someone to cause trouble. Didn't he just want people to know that the archery skills of the Mahist army and Black Cloud cavalry were only so-so? Seeing Yili become angry, Qin Feng asked in a low voice, "Wang Fei, how many people should this subordinate send to deal with him?" Even Qi Lin did not have many people who could achieve such a demanding archery skill, but fortunately, it was not impossible. Right now, among the hundreds of Qi Lin, there could be 7 or 8 who would accept the challenge. But in his previous life, there might not be anyone in the northern tribes who had the strength of this person in front of him. Otherwise, how could he be the #1 archer of the northern tribes? Yili shook her head, indifferently saying, "This kind of trash doesn't need a Qilin to make a move, maybe Yelu Yi just wants to meet a Qilin." How could a Qilin be someone that anyone could meet whenever they wanted to? The so-called special forces, no matter what era it was, were synonymous with mystery. If everyone could guess their battle strength, then what was the point of being a secret trump card? "I'm afraid that Officer Yun is going to lose." Qin Feng pointed at Yunting, who was preparing to shoot the last arrow. There were still 13 copper coins hanging on the tree. Yunting would not be able to shoot all of them down in one shot. Yili smiled lightly, "It's a good thing for young people to have some spirit. Losing to the #1 archer of the northern tribes, he is not wronged." Qin Feng nodded, "Wang Fei is right." When Yunting's last arrow left the bowstring, he actually shot out 3 copper coins at once. Even so, it was clear that Yunting had lost this round. The young handsome face was as cold as ice, and there was a trace of depression that was hard to detect. The man from the northern tribe smiled, "This young master, you have lost 50 taels." Yunting's face darkened as he took out a 50 taels silver ingot and handed it to the man from the northern tribes. Then he turned and jumped off the stage. When this consort returns, this consort will definitely thank the crown prince of the northern tribes. What she meant was that Huyen LV had been famous for a long time, yet he had challenged 2 young generals of the Mahist army in public. He was clearly bullying the weak. Yili smiled as she looked at Huyen LV. Her calm eyes held a faint coldness. Did Huyen LV think that after leaving the northern tribes for so many years, no one would recognize him? Even if others did not recognize him, the crown prince of the northern tribes would recognize him. Huyen LV was shocked. He forced a smile and said, "Since Princess Consort wants to fight, this one naturally welcomes you. Princess Consort, please." He planned to use his identity as an excuse. Yili did not care. She tilted her head and looked at the gem-studded dagger in the center of the arena. She smiled and said, "The gift from the king of the northern tribes must not be ordinary. Then this consort will not be polite." Huyen LV's face darkened. He said, "Let's wait for Princess Consort to win." He retreated to the side and handed the bow and arrow to Yili. Huyen LV did not make things difficult for Yili with the bow and arrow. He was not an idiot. If he took out a bow that even a burly man would find difficult to draw in front of everyone, it would be thought that he was bullying Princess Ding because she was a girl. Thus, it was better to choose a suitable bow to defeat himself. Huyen LV had absolute confidence in his archery skills. He naturally did not believe that the graceful and weak woman in front of him was a godly archer with 100 hits. He had heard of the story of how Princess Ding had scared Princess Lingyun to tears with a single arrow. But in his view, the Princess Ding of that time could barely even shoot an arrow. Yili calmly took the bow and arrow from Huyen LV and tested it. She smiled faintly and said, "Good bow." Huyen LV proudly said, "The bows of my northern tribes are naturally good." A few dozen steps away, there were already new copper coins hanging from the tree. Huyen LV said, "Wang Fei can walk closer before shooting." Yili smiled faintly and said, "Many thanks for General Huyen's good intentions." If it was someone else, they might have accepted Huyen LV's good intentions. But Yili knew that when it came to archery, the closer you were, the better. For example, in the current situation, if you were to stand directly under the tree, even if you were a godly archer, you would not be able to shoot down all the copper coins. Under everyone's gaze, Yili calmly reached out and picked up 3 arrows. She placed them on her shoulder and drew the bow. Everyone sucked in a breath. Princess Ding was actually planning to shoot 3 arrows at the same time. They saw Yili skillfully draw the bow. She slightly moved her position and then let go without hesitation. They heard the arrows fly through the air. Under the lantern light, 3 silver lights shot out towards the distant tree. Then they heard the crisp sound of copper coins falling to the ground. Yili's hands did not stop. She did not even look to see how many of the first 3 arrows had hit. She once again picked up 3 arrows and drew the bowstring. She shot, there was a crisp sound. Before anyone could react, Yili had already drawn the bow again. This time, she really did turn her body. She squatted on the ground and shot 3 arrows from the bottom up. In the blink of an eye, only one of the 10 arrows was left. Everyone looked down at the tree. There were still 5 copper coins hanging on the tree. Many people were already secretly worried for Yili. But no matter who won or lost this battle, no one would doubt the archery skills of the Mahist army. Not far away, in a side room of the concentrated fragrance pavilion, there was an open window facing the arena below. 2 men sat facing each other. Looking at the arena below, their expressions were complicated. "Li Wang, what do you think?" Princess Ding's last arrow was. Mo Jingli raised his head and drank the wine in his cup. He coldly said, "What does Yili's victory or defeat have to do with I? The reputation of the Mahist army does not belong to I. That howling moon blade also does not belong to I. Hearing this, Yellow Yi could not help but shake his head and sigh. Prince Ding is really lucky. If he could have such a woman as his wife, it would be the greatest blessing in the world. Bang! Mo Jingli heavily slammed the wine cup in his hand on the table. The wine jug and plates on the table shook. Yellow Yi smiled as he looked at Mo Jingli's gloomy expression. He smiled and said, "Speaking of which, Princess Ding was originally the fiancée appointed by the late Emperor of the Chu state to Li Wang. What a pity, Kacha." The wine cup in Mo Jingli's hand shattered, leaving only fragments in his hand. In the other room, Lei Tingfeng and Genom of Gojoseon were also paying attention to the arena. Lei Tingfeng smiled and praised, "I did not expect Princess Ding to improve so quickly. I remember that 2 years ago, Princess Ding was not even familiar with drawing a bow." "Father, who do you think will win?" Genom of Gojoseon did not seem to hear. He only focused on the azure-clothed woman on the arena. His eyes flashed with a strange light. Lei Tingfeng did not say anything. He quietly lowered his eyes. No one knew what he was thinking. Chapter 465. On the stage, Hu Yanlu stared at the green-clothed woman in front of him as he tried to hide the shock in his heart. "Princess Ding, this is the last arrow." Yili smiled and calmly took the arrow. This time, she was not in a hurry. Instead, she slowly knocked the arrow and took aim. Everyone could not help but hold their breaths as they looked at the few remaining copper plates on the tree. They saw Yili suddenly leap forward. She stopped on the table behind her and jumped up. While in the air, she quickly drew the bow and shot an arrow. Whoosh! The arrow was nailed into the tree. Everyone stared blankly at the empty tree in front of them. The copper plates hanging from the tree had disappeared without a trace. Those with sharp eyes could see that there were a few strings of the same length hanging from the tree. Princess Ding's last arrow had actually broken a thin thread. How could this kind of archery skills and eyesight not shock people? Yili turned to look at the pale Hu Yanlu and smiled faintly. The same rules. If General Huyen can stand aside, then this consort will lose. The crowd was in an uproar. Previously, it was Hu Yanlu who had set up the stage to challenge everyone. Now, the situation was reversed. Princess Ding was challenging Hu Yanlu, the #1 expert of the northern tribes. The crowd below the stage was discussing. Yun Ting, who had a cold face, was now very excited. "How is it, General Huyen? Don't tell me you don't dare to accept our consort's challenge." Hu Yanlu's face was ashen. He did not dare. Hu Yanlu was known as the #1 expert of the northern tribes. He naturally had real skills. If he had more time, he might have been able to do what Yili had just done. But now, he was powerless. He could shoot 1 arrow at a time and guarantee that he could shoot down all the copper coins within 10 arrows. But he could not control 3 arrows to shoot down 7 or 8 copper coins at the same time. And Yili clearly knew this. That was why she had given him such a difficult problem. "General Huyen," Yili reminded with a smile. "This one concedes." Hu Yanlu gritted his teeth and said. When he raised his head, he was immediately booed. Yili walked to the center of the ring and picked up the gem-studded dagger that was placed on the shelf and pulled it out. A gust of cold air immediately rushed out. The bright blade was so shiny that it could reflect one's reflection. The sharp and cold blade showed that this blade had drunk countless amounts of blood. Yili casually waved her hand, and the table in front of her immediately shattered. Yili returned the saber to its scabbard and praised, "It really is a good saber. Many thanks to General Huyen." Seeing Yili put away the treasured saber in her sleeve, Hu Yanlu's complexion turned ashen, but he had nothing to say. He could only look on helplessly as Yili walked down the stage with the treasured saber that he was so proud of. Yili took the Howling Moon saber and jumped down the stage. Enchanting immediately rushed up and greedily said, "Princess, can this subordinate take a look at the treasured saber that you won?" That was a famous treasured saber of the northern tribes. There were many swordsmiths in Dechu State, and there were many famous treasured swords. But the craftsmanship of the saber was not as good as that of the western tomb and the northern tribes. Especially since the northern tribes were good at using sabers. The sabers that they made were all top quality, not to mention the famous Howling Moon saber. Yili glanced at him with a smile that was not a smile. Enchanting suddenly remembered the trouble that he had caused before. The excitement on his face immediately turned to depression and fear. After appreciating his depressed appearance, Yili smiled and threw the treasured saber into his hands. Enchanting hurriedly thanked her. He held the arrow in his hand and studied it carefully. His fondness for it was evident in his words. "Your Highness's archery is truly marvelous." "This subordinate is extremely impressed," Chen Yun said sincerely as he followed beside Yili. Ever since the martial arts competition last year, Chen Yun had been full of admiration for this young Wang Fei. After today's scene, it was even more convincing. Yili smiled and said, "How is it as mysterious as you say it is?" "I just put in a little more effort than usual. On the battlefield, there is no need for everyone to shoot copper coins from trees in the middle of the night. You are killing enemies on the battlefield, not performing in the arena." Chen Yun smiled but did not speak. He understood that the princess was comforting him. He only decided that when he returned, he would work even harder to practice his archery skills. Chen Yun and Enchanting lived in the military camp and were not going the same way as Yili. When they parted, Enchanting could only reluctantly return the treasured saber to Yili. Looking at his eager appearance, Yili smiled faintly and threw the saber back into his hands, saying, "If you like it, then take it." "Ah!" Enchanting stilled and was overjoyed. At the side, Chen Yun helplessly rolled his eyes at him. With his pitiful and reluctant appearance, those who did not know would think that the one that Wang Fei was taking away was not a saber but his beloved. He knew that Wang Fei was very tolerant of the people around her, so he did not stop Enchanting from being foolish. When Enchanting reacted, he carefully held the saber and asked in a daze, "Wang Fei is really giving it to me?" Yili smiled and said, "I didn't come for his saber. It was just a coincidence. Even more, there is no one in Wang Fei who likes to use this kind of saber. Since you like it so much, you can keep it." Compared to this kind of curved sword, Yili preferred light and straight daggers and military knives. Even more, the beautiful gems and decorations on the scabbard were not suitable to be carried around as a weapon. When Yili gave an affirmative reply, Enchanting stupidly held the saber. He looked as though he wanted to put the saber in his mouth and take a bite to see if it was real. Chen Yun, who was standing beside him, couldn't help but secretly take a step back, embarrassed to walk with him. Yili looked at Chen Yun and said with a smile, "Ben Fei remembers that Field Officer Qin uses a spear and needs a close combat weapon to protect yourself. I just recently received a cold rhino blade. Later, I will have someone send it to you to see if it suits you." Chen Yun was overjoyed. The scabbard of the cold rhino blade was not as beautiful as the Howling Moon in Enchanting's hands, but the blade was not any worse. Because they had been forged by the same master. And it was more practical than the Howling Moon blade. Because the Howling Moon had been obtained by the royal house of the northern tribes, it had been decorated so beautifully that it was not suitable for the battlefield. The cold rhino blade had always maintained the original simplicity and sharpness of the blacksmith. "This subordinate thanks Wang Fei." Yili waved her hand and said with a smile, "No need. It is a good thing that a good weapon can find a good owner. Ben Fei will go first. It is rare for me to have some free time. You guys can play. Farewell, Wang Fei." The place where Yili and the others were speaking was only a dozen steps away from the stage. Yili's careless action of tossing the Howling Moon saber to Yunting was naturally seen by many people. The common people naturally thought that Princess Ding treated her subordinates well and was benevolent. But the people involved all had dark expressions. In Ningxiang Pavilion, Yilu Yi and Imo Jingli both stared at the graceful figure walking away amidst the crowd. A trace of gloom and anger flashed across Yilu Ye's eyes. Yili had exposed Hu Yanlu's true identity in front of everyone. But after winning the Howling Moon blade, she had carelessly given it to a lowly military officer. This was clearly looking down on the royal house of the northern tribes in him, Yilu Yi. Yilu Yi, who had always been arrogant, was once again rebuffed by Yili. How could he swallow this anger? Yilu Yi stood up and wanted to jump down from the window to chase after the figure that was gradually blending into the crowd. But he suddenly felt a cold gaze shoot towards him with undisguised killing intent. Following the direction of his gaze, he saw a man with snow-white hair staring at him with a cold expression through an open window on the opposite street corner. Yilu Ye's heart jumped. He suppressed the chill in his heart and slowly sat down. Mo Xiaoyao watched him sit back down. His lips hooked in a cold smile as he raised the wine cup in his hand. Yilu Yi gave a cold snort. He raised the wine cup in front of him and drained it in one gulp. Chapter 466. Princess Ding is indeed a unique woman, this prince admires you. In a quiet room, the crown prince of the northern tribes, Yelu Hong, looked at Imo Xiaoyao and smiled. Just now, everyone's attention was focused on the arena below, and did not notice that the crown prince of the northern tribes and Prince Ding were watching from a room on the second floor. Imo Xiaoyao snorted, but his cold face had a bit of warmth. Obviously, he was very satisfied with Yelu Hong's compliment. Princess Ronghua sat next to Yelu Hong. She used to be the proud and beautiful princess of the royal family in the capital, but now in the northern tribes, she was even more gentle and charming. Princess Ronghua gently leaned against Yelu Hong, and poured wine for him from time to time. Her beautiful eyes were slightly narrowed, but there was a bit of bitterness and complexity. Just 2 years ago, she hadn't put Ding Wangfei in her eyes at all. But in just 2 years, the gap between her and Princess Ding had become so big that she felt ashamed to even be mentioned in the same breath. Looking at Princess Ding's calm demeanor on the arena and her archery skills that even the best archer of the northern tribes could not match, Princess Ronghua knew that Princess Ding was someone she would never be able to match in her life. The door of the room was gently pushed open from the outside. Yili stood at the door with a smile and said, "Crown Prince Yelu, I'm sorry to disturb you." Yelu Hong was startled, but quickly smiled and said, "How would I dare? This prince is honored to have princess here. Please come in." Yili stepped into the room and walked to Mo Xiaoyao's side. Mo Xiaoyao reached out to help her sit down, and said softly, "Just find someone to play with him." Why did Princess Li personally compete with him? Yili smiled and said, "I just wanted to see how good the #1 archer of the northern tribes is." Yelu Hong raised his cup and smiled, "I've embarrassed myself in front of Princess." Although Hu Yanlu was known as the #1 archer of the northern tribes, that was only a matter of more than 10 years ago. The current Hu Yanlu. Yelu Hong shook his head and smiled, "Let's not talk about such a disappointing person. Come, Princess, Prince, please." Yili raised her wine cup and said with a faint smile, "Crown Prince, Crown Princess, please." A few days before Prince Ding's 1-month-old birthday party, the entire Ruyang city was filled with singing and dancing. Behind all this singing and dancing, there were also some agreements that had been reached in secret. For example, trading with Nanzhao and purchasing large amounts of medicinal herbs from Nanzhao every year. Another example would be secretly purchasing large amounts of grain from a grain merchant in Dechu State. or the temporary agreement with the crown prince of the northern tribes to stabilize the borders was carried out without the knowledge of the public. As a result, compared to the joyous and peaceful people outside, the people inside the Prince Ding mansion were busier than usual. Reporting to Princess Genom of Gojosian and Crown Prince Genom of Gojosian request an audience. Yili had a rare moment of free time to accompany the baby in her room. The baby, who was almost a month old, was not as sleepy as when he was just born. He opened his round eyes and looked at Yili. His dark eyes seemed to be covered with a layer of water, causing Yili's heart to soften. She felt that no matter how much she loved this baby, it would not be enough. Hearing Lin Han's report, Yili frowned and asked, "Is the prince in the mansion?" Lin Han said, "The prince accompanied young Master Qingchen out of the city this morning and has not returned yet. Would you like to invite Genom of Gojosian to come back tomorrow?" Everyone in the Prince Ding mansion did not have a good impression of Genom of Gojosian. Shuo Jing, Lin Han and the others were still brooding over the incident of Princess Fei falling off the cliff. Naturally, they did not wish for Yili to see Genom of Gojosian again. Yili put down Mo Xiaobao and said with a faint smile, "No need. Right now, we are in the Prince Ding mansion. If Ben Fei refuses to see you, it will seem cowardly." Lin Han was silent and retreated to the door to wait for Yili to come out. Not long after, Yili had already settled Mo Xiaobao down. She led Qing Wan and the others out of the room and towards the front hall. In the main hall of the Prince Ding mansion, Lei Tingfeng sat calmly below Genom of Gojosian and looked at the furnishings of the main hall. To be fair, the Prince Ding mansion in Ruyang was not as magnificent as the Prince Ding mansion in Chujing. Because it was newly renovated, it did not even have the ancient and gloomy atmosphere of the Ding mansion in Chujing. Instead, it had more of the rough simplicity and freedom of the Northwest. Genom of Gojosian was also looking at the entire main hall, but his gaze was more focused on the direction of the door. Hearing the tinkling sound of ornaments outside the door, Genom of Gojosian's eyes became deeper and sharper. Yili stepped into the main hall and laughed loudly. Ben Fei came late and made Prince and Shitzi wait for a long time. "Director Mo, why didn't you serve tea to the guests?" Lin Han, who was beside Yili, glanced at Genom of Gojosian and his son, who were sitting empty, and said lightly, replying to Princess, "Director Mo went to arrange for people to decorate Mr. Qingyun's new residence." Lei Tingfeng also knew that he and his son were not welcomed in the Prince Ding mansion. He smiled bitterly in his heart and said to Yili, "Princess, you don't have to be polite." Yili smiled sweetly and said, "Etiquette can't be ignored. Recently, the mansion has been very busy. Director Mo is inevitably negligent. Shitzi, please forgive me." No matter when, it was difficult to see any unexpected emotions in her eyes or face. It was as if she was really a gentle and harmless lady from a famous family. One could never see any emotions such as curiosity, surprise, or worry on her face. The pressure such a person gave to the opponent during negotiations was unimaginable because one could never find out her bottom line. Perhaps her bottom line was only a few millimeters away from yours, but it felt like it was thousands of miles away. Chapter 467. It was not the first time Lei Tingfeng had been so depressed. After a moment of disgust, he did not care. He continued, "Wang Fei should know that there are many transactions and exchanges between our country, Dongchu, and Nanzhao every year. Many of these goods need to pass through the Northwest. While Xiling was large, it was a country lacking in material resources. Many things had to be imported from other countries. Of course, Xiling pursued the principle of being strong if you could rob, but there were always some things that could not be robbed. For example, the silk, satin, tea, and porcelain that the Emperor of Xiling loved had to be bought from Nanzhao and the Dechu state. These things were not available in the small countries of the West. In the end, the people of Xiling and the people of Dechu State were of the same origin, so most of the people of Xiling were more used to the products of Dechu State. The northwest was the communication stronghold between Dechu State and Xiling. If these things wanted to be transported back to Xiling, they had to pass through the northwest. As for the roads in the southwest, it had been said since ancient times that the Shu Road was as difficult as ascending to heaven. It was already very difficult to enter Shu, and they had to travel through mountains and rivers to send the caravans back to Xiling. Not to mention the long detours, the dangers and bandits on the road were enough to make most merchants retreat. Yili smiled. Lei Tingfeng had only said one sentence, and she understood the purpose of their visit today. In reality, the Prince Ding mansion had been waiting for their arrival. But Yili had not expected that it was not the people of Xiling who wanted to raise their status to buy time, but Mo Xiaoyao who had refused to let them in. Gently putting the teacup back on the table, Yili leaned back in her chair and looked at Lei Tingfeng. She asked, "I understand Shizi's meaning. Originally, opening up the roads and allowing trade between the two countries is a good thing. But, what benefits does this have to the northwest? In short, why would the Mahist army allow the Xiling caravans to pass through?" Lei Tingfeng's eyes darkened slightly. He smiled and said, "Even during wartime, the two countries do not restrict caravans. Mutual exchange has always been a consensus between our country, Dongchu, Northern Army, and Nanzhao." Wang Fei's words make me puzzled. Yili looked down and smiled faintly. Since that's the case, the West Hill caravan can go through the northwest. Why does the heir have to specifically ask this consort? Lei Tingfeng choked on his bet. When the so-called consensus was implemented, most of the time, it was just a piece of waste paper. The trade route was long and eventful. Bandits might appear at any time. Who could say for sure whether it was an accident or not? At least in the past year, especially in the past half a year, the number of traveling merchants from Xiling to Dechu State was even fewer than during the war. Nowadays, the prices of many things in the Emperor of Xiling City were still very high. He only heard Yili say unhurriedly, "Shizi said that traveling merchants are not allowed during wartime, but this consort expresses her doubts. If the two countries were at war, they would naturally want to kill each other. At that time, would the Dechu State still agree to sell silk and grain to the West Hill? Would he still agree to Nanzhao's medicinal herbs being transported from Dechu State to West Hill? Besides, even if none of this matters, how would Shizi distinguish whether the merchants that came during wartime were real merchants or spies?" Lei Tingfeng paused for a moment and then sighed helplessly. He looked at Genom of Gojosian who had been sitting quietly and listening to them talk. Genom of Gojosian finally raised his head and stared at Yili. He asked, "What conditions does Princess Ding want?" Yili smiled slightly and waved her hand at Lin Han behind her. Lin Han neatly took out 2 booklets and gave one to Genom of Gojosian and Lei Tingfeng. Genom of Gojosian took it and looked suspiciously at Yili before lowering his head to open it. A moment later, he raised his head and asked, "According to what Wang Fei says, what benefits does West Hill have?" Yili smiled faintly and said, "Since the Northwest can accommodate trade with the countries of the 4 seas, naturally West Hill cannot be treated differently. Genom of Gojosian and Shizi's conditions will naturally be resolved, right?" Genom of Gojosian frowned and said in a low voice, "I need time to consider." Yili smiled and said, "Of course. Prince and Shizi can answer before they leave Ruyang." Genom of Gojosian put away the booklet and stood to look at Yili. He said, "Wang Fei really does not intend to consider I's original proposal. If Wang Fei is willing to come to West Hill, I will treat you with the courtesy of Prime Minister." Yili was startled and couldn't help but laugh. Just as she was about to answer, she heard Mo Xiaoyao's cold voice from outside the door. "Thank you for Genom of Gojosian's kindness." Ai's beloved concubine does not need the position of Prime Minister of West Hill. Moreover, who does not know that the position of Prime Minister is just an empty title in West Hill? Mo Xiaoyao stepped into the hall with a cold aura. He looked disdainfully at Genom of Gojosian in front of him and did not hide the killing intent in his cold eyes. The original position of Prime Minister of West Hill was not an empty title. No matter which country it was, the position of Prime Minister was definitely important and even superior to tens of thousands of people. However, when it came to Genom of Gojosian's generation, there was a change. The original Prime Minister of West Hill was loyal to the previous Emperor of Xiling and was naturally loyal to the current Emperor of Xiling. In the early years, he had made trouble for Genom of Gojosian. However, even though the Emperor of Xiling was not as wise as Genom of Gojosian, he still knew that the Prime Minister was one of his own. He defended him in court, and for many years, Genom of Gojosian did not have a good time. It was only in recent years that the old Prime Minister, who had been through 2 dynasties, was exhausted to death. The subsequent Prime Ministers were just puppets and could not make any decisions. Now that Genom of Gojosian said that he would treat Yili with the courtesy of the Prime Minister, it was naturally very interesting to those who knew the truth. Su Qingchen followed behind Mo Xiaoyao and entered. When he saw Genom of Gojosian and Lei Tingfeng, he only raised his eyebrows slightly and looked at Yili with a smile. Yili smiled helplessly and waved for someone to serve tea to Mo Xiaoyao and Su Qingchen. Lei Tingfeng looked at Su Qingchen for a moment and smiled. "Young Master Qingchen, long time no see. You are even more elegant than before." Su Qingchen smiled leisurely, as if he did not have the slightest trace of smoke. "Your Highness is joking. It hasn't been that long. Didn't we meet in the south last year?" Lei Tingfeng's eyes darkened slightly and smiled. This one remembered wrongly. Last year in the south, Su Qingchen had caused him no small amount of trouble. Lei Tingfeng naturally would not underestimate this seemingly free and unrestrained young man who had been crowned as the world's #1 young master by the people of Dechu State. While this side was peaceful, the other side was not so polite. Mo Xiaoyao casually sat next to Yili and leaned against the back of the chair. He lazily looked at Genom of Gojosian and asked, "Genom of Gojosian has graced us with your presence. What brings you here?" Yili softly explained the purpose of Genom of Gojosian's visit. Everyone in the hall listened and waited for Mo Xiaoyao's reply. In the end, Mo Xiaoyao still had the final say in the Prince Ding mansion in the northwest. If he did not agree, then it would be a waste of time to say anything else. Mo Xiaoyao's cold face revealed a trace of a cold smile. He looked at Genom of Gojosian and smiled. Didn't Genom of Gojosian say that he wanted to compare notes with I? It just so happens that I have some free time today. As long as Genom of Gojosian defeats I, anything can be discussed. Everyone was stunned. They did not expect that Mo Xiaoyao would want to fight with Genom of Gojosian at this time. Lei Tingfeng frowned and said, "Prince Ding, now." Mo Xiaoyao interrupted Lei Tingfeng and said with a smile, "Don't worry, heir, I will definitely not bully Genom of Gojosian because he is missing a hand. At worst, I will also fight with Genom of Gojosian with one hand." Chapter 468. Hearing this, the hall was filled with a chill. Genom of Gojosian stared darkly at Mo Xiaoyao and said coldly, "Prince Ding is too conceited. Do you think you have the ability to fight with I with one hand?" Everyone knew that Genom of Gojosian's left arm was a taboo. That was also the worst defeat in Genom of Gojosian's life. Not only was his undefeated record broken, his personal guards were almost completely wiped out before they managed to save him. Even so, he still paid the price of an arm to escape from Mo Liufang's hands. Now that the person who mocked him was Mo Liufang's son, it was even more unbearable. Mo Xiaoyao didn't care about Genom of Gojosian's anger, and said casually, it's still easier than waiting for Genom of Gojosian to grow a new arm, right? Impudent. Genom of Gojosian was furious. His right hand slammed heavily on the armrest, and he leapt into the air, sending a palm strike towards Mo Xiuyao. Mo Xiuyao snorted, and with a wave of his sleeves, he grabbed Yili with one hand and dodged Genom of Gojosian's attack. When Genom of Gojosian and the others chased after them, Mo Xiuyao had already landed on the ground with Yili in his arms. He even had the time to comb her hair that was blown by the wind. Then, he turned to face Genom of Gojosian and took 2 steps forward, saying indifferently, "Please." Genom of Gojosian snorted coldly, and flew towards Mo Xiuyao. Mo Xiuyao didn't avoid him either, and the two of them began to fight in the courtyard outside the hall. This action naturally attracted the attention of many people in the Prince Ding mansion. Everyone who heard the news stared at the fight between Genom of Gojosian and Lei Tingfeng, who was watching from the side. Feng Zhiyao was even more anxious to see the world in chaos. He stood beside Yili and said with a grin, "Wang Fei, has our prince's martial arts improved yet again? Prince Ding has single-handedly challenged the #1 master of West Hill. Once this news spreads, I don't know how many people will bow down to the name of our prince." The people present were all people with sharp ears and eyes, so they naturally heard Feng Zhiyao's words clearly. When he looked again, Prince Ding had indeed only used one hand when he was fighting with Genom of Gojosian. His other hand was behind his back and did not move at all. Genom of Gojosian naturally heard this as well. His expression became even more gloomy, and his moves became even more fierce. Even though it seemed fair to use one hand to fight with the other, there were not that many fools in this world. Genom of Gojosian had been crippled for more than 10 years, so he was already used to using one hand. Prince Ding, on the other hand, had always used 2 hands. Now that he was using only one hand, his combat power was definitely not as good as before. In this way, Genom of Gojosian would look bad if he lost, but it would also be dishonorable if he won. Even though the Prince Ding mansion had strict rules, the people who had free time were still quite relaxed. For example, at this moment, the people who had nothing to do to watch the fight between their prince and Genom of Gojosian had already started to bet on who would win and who would lose. However, the results of the bets were somewhat distorted. They were all betting that their prince would win. In this way, if they lost, they would not have to pay, but if they won, they would not have to pay, so the bets could not be opened. Feng Zhiyao smiled from ear to ear as he approached Lei Tingfeng and said, "Prince Lei, do you want to place a bet? Do you think our prince will win, or your family's king of axes?" Lei Tingfeng glanced at him indifferently. Naturally, he would not answer such a question. Feng Zhiyao did not mind his indifference. He turned and asked Yili, "Princess consort, what do you think?" Yili was focused on the fight in front of her, and did not have the mind to pay attention to Feng Zhiyao's words. Speaking of which, this was the first time she had seen the real fight between the world's top 4 masters. The others were also watching seriously. After all, such a fight was not common. For those who practice martial arts, watching such a battle between experts was also very beneficial to their own martial arts cultivation. The only person present who was not interested was Su Qingchen. Even though young Master Qingchen was a genius, he did not know anything about martial arts. With his cultivation and knowledge, he naturally had no interest in watching the spectacle. Looking at the mesmerized crowd in the courtyard, young Master Qingchen could only helplessly leave quietly and return to his study to deal with his own matters. This fight lasted for nearly 4 hours, and the original bet quickly spread from the Prince Ding mansion to the entire Ruyang city. Han Mingxi, who had heard the news, rushed over to be the banker. He had people continuously broadcast the results of the fight to the outside world, and at the same time, set a new betting record. The citizens of Ruyang City naturally supported their prince without any hesitation. However, those who supported Genom of Gojosian did not say anything. Although the number of people who supported Prince Ding was not as many as those who placed their bets on him, the number of people who placed their bets was not a problem. Therefore, for a moment, the two of them appeared to be evenly matched. In the courtyard of the Prince Ding mansion, the two figures exchanged blows at lightning speed. Their speed was so fast that it was almost impossible to see their moves clearly. After the two palms met again, the two of them retreated a few steps back. Jenim of Gojosian's expression was hidden. His originally gorgeous sleeves had been shredded by the fierce wind from the palms, making them look ragged. Mo Xiaoyao lowered his eyes slightly. His face was slightly pale, and a strand of snow-white hair fell in front of his face. It was obvious that it had been cut off by the wind from the palms. Jenim of Gojosian laughed coldly and said, Mo Xiaoyao, do you really think that you can use I with one hand? Mo Xiaoyao raised his head and smiled faintly. Why don't you try and see if I can cut off your other hand as well? Impudent brat. Jenim of Gojosian angrily rebuked. He waved his palm, and the force of his palm surged towards Mo Xiaoyao with the force of a landslide. Mo Xiaoyao's body turned, and like a spiral, he leapt up and turned in the air at a strange angle, directly aiming for Jenim of Gojosian's right arm. Father, be careful. Lei Tingfeng cried out in alarm. Jenim of Gojosian snorted coldly. His palms did not stop, and he quickly sent out a few palms to stop Mo Xiaoyao's attack. The two of them once again fought back and forth. Yili did not see the end of this competition. As she watched the sun set in the west, Yili got up and returned to her room to take care of her precious son. In any case, in the Prince Ding mansion, even if Mo Xiaoyao could not win against Jenim of Gojosian would definitely not be able to hurt him. When she returned to her room, Mo Xiaobao was indeed fine. He was crying loudly in his wet nurse's arms. Because Yili did not like wet nurses to take care of children, Mo Xiaobao did not like to be carried by wet nurses other than when he was drinking milk. Even the two madams of the Su family were more liked by Mo Xiaobao than wet nurses. When Yili returned to her room, the two wet nurses were being tormented by Mo Xiaobao until they were covered in sweat. She walked over and took him into her arms. Mo Xiaobao's large eyes looked at his mother. He sniffled and rubbed his little nose in Yili's arms before falling asleep. Yili looked at the little bun in her arms with interest. She did not know if such a small thing could recognize people, but it was clear that the little baby could recognize her and Mo Xiaoyao. This proved that no matter how much Mo Xiaobao cried, as long as he was in her arms, he would definitely not cry again. Similarly, no matter how happy he was, as long as he was awake, he would definitely cry until the sky turned dark in Mo Xiaoyao's hands. Yili could not help but wonder where this 1-month-old little guy got so much strength and tears. Just as she was coaxing Mo Xiaobao to sleep, the servant outside reported that first Madame Su, second Madame Su, and young Miss Qin had arrived. Yili hurriedly had someone invite the three of them in. Eldest aunt, second aunt, older sister Zheng, why are you here? Why are you here? Yili carried Xiaobao out and asked with a smile. Chapter 469. Su Defuren smiled. I heard that there was a fight in the front yard. Although the Su family was not pedantic, but women generally did not go to the front yard, especially now that Qin Zheng was preparing for marriage and the two Su Furens also had to prepare for the wedding. Yili smiled and said, Aunt, you don't have to worry. His Royal Highness and Shilin Jinan Wang are just playing around. Even as women, they had heard of Jenim of Gojosian's reputation, how could they not be worried? So they sat in the parlor and chatted with Yili while waiting for news. Only when the sky was completely dark did Qing Wan run back and smile, reporting to Wang Fei, the fight in the front yard is over. Yili raised her eyebrows and smiled, who won? Qing Wan grabbed the end of her braid and said with some confusion, this it seems that no one won and no one lost, it was a draw. But in the end, Genom of Gojosian spat out blood, probably Genom of Gojosian lost. Neither lost nor won. Then clearly won. If it was a draw, then the house would win. Qinghuan covered her mouth and smiled. Maybe, when I came back just now, I saw young Master Han smiling very happily. Prince said that after sending off Genom of Gojosian and Shitzi, he would come back to have dinner with Wang Fei. Yili nodded and smiled. Let the kitchen prepare a few dishes that Prince likes. Qinghuan smiled and left. Knowing that there was nothing else, the two Su Furens and Qingjing also got up and left. After a while, Mo Xiaoyao had already returned. Seeing Yili holding Mo Xiaobao, who refused to sleep, in one hand and holding a book in the other to pass the time, he frowned unhappily. Hearing the footsteps, Yili quickly put down the book and smiled. You're back. Are you hurt? Mo Xiaoyao snorted softly. He picked up the swaddling blanket that was wrapped in little treasure Mo and walked towards the bed. Yili was shocked. It was scary enough for a 1-month-old baby to be carried in swaddling clothes. Seeing Mo Xiaoyao put the baby back into the cradle, Yili let out a sigh of relief. Mo Xiaobao didn't cry and even looked at her with his big round eyes. She was just about to ask Mo Xiaoyao about Mo Xiaobao's safety when the baby she gave birth to would be tortured to death by his own father. Before Yili could say anything, Mo Xiaoyao let out a muffled groan and sat down on the bed. A trace of blood flowed from the corner of his lips. Yili was shocked and frightened. How could she still remember to blame Mo Xiaoyao as a father? She hurriedly got up and asked someone to call Shen Yang over. Mo Xiaoyao reached out to grab her and shook his head. Yili frowned and looked at him for a while. Other than his face being a bit pale, there was nothing wrong with him. Only then did she relax a bit. She wiped the blood from the corner of his lips and asked, "Why didn't you say that you had internal injuries? Didn't you say that it was a draw and Genom of Gojosian vomited blood?" Mo Xiaoyao smiled faintly. Enchanting is one of the top 4 masters in the world. How can there be no price to pay when fighting with him? Yili looked at him unhappily and said, "So, Genom of Gojosian vomited blood in front of others, but Prince came back and vomited blood behind others' backs." Mo Xiaoyao snorted and looked at Yili without refuting. Of course, he couldn't tell Yili that Enchanting didn't intend to vomit blood, but he was angered by him in the end. So Enchanting didn't vomit blood because he was injured, but because he was angered. Mo Xiaoyao couldn't help but frown when he thought of Enchanting's last pawn strike. The number 1 master of the West Hill was indeed worthy of his reputation. If they were to compare moves to his full strength, he might be able to beat Enchanting because of his uninjured hands. But if they were to compare internal energy, he seemed to be slightly inferior. But it didn't matter. He wasn't even 30 years old, but Enchanting was already close to 50 years old. If he could still beat Enchanting in terms of ability, then Enchanting's title as the number 1 master of the West Hill wouldn't be so genuine. Even if they didn't use their internal energy, he could still kill him. Whenever he thought of the way that old man looked at Yili, Mo Xiaoyao couldn't control the murderous intent in his eyes. Mo Xiaoyao suddenly felt that his last words to Enchanting were too tactful. That old and ugly man's face didn't even deserve to look at Yili. Thinking of something, Mo Xiaoyao thoughtfully raised his hand to touch the mask on his face. Yili looked strangely at the man who was sitting by the bed in a daze. She raised her hand to touch his forehead and asked, "What's wrong? Are your injuries too serious?" "It's nothing." Mo Xiaoyao smiled and said, "I'm just thinking about tomorrow's banquet. I don't know if Enchanting will be able to attend." Yili sat down beside him and said with a smile, "What's there to think about? The so-called banquet is just a formality. The truly important matters were dealt with before and after the banquet. The full moon banquet was just a show for ordinary people. As for whether Genom of Gojosian could attend, Mo Xiaoyao wouldn't be so reckless as to beat Genom of Gojosian until he couldn't get out of bed, right? On this day, Ruyang City was once again in an uproar. Although most people didn't see the duel between Genom of Gojosian and Prince Ding, there wasn't a single person in Ruyang City who didn't know about it. So much so that after the duel ended, no matter which side they supported, they all hung their heads in dejection and secretly felt sorry for their wallets. Only the banker, Han Mingxi's extraordinarily handsome face smiled more and more seductively. Who told Prince Ding to personally admit that he had tied with Genom of Gojosian? No one won. In the end, the winner was naturally Han Mingxi. Located not far from the Prince Ding mansion, the Han estate was Han Mingxi's residence in Ruyang City. At this time, Han Mingyue was facing a table full of banknotes, silver ingots, jade, jewelry, and so on with a smile. Feng Zhiyao sat to the side and cast a sidelong glance at the overjoyed Han Mingyue and snorted in displeasure. Han Mingxi raised his head and glanced at him. He got up and walked to his side, sat down, and said with a smile, "Young Master Feng-san, how come you have time to come to my humble home?" Feng Zhiyao glanced at the things on the table that he hadn't had time to put away and asked, "How much did you earn?" Han Mingxi raised his eyebrows and proudly gestured a number. Feng Zhiyao was immediately envious and jealous. He fiercely glared at Han Mingxi, 50,000 taels. That included his own 800 taels. Han Mingxi contemptuously glanced at him and said with a smile, "Young Master Feng-san, aren't you looking down on Prince Ding and Genom of Gojosian too much? What is 50,000 taels? 500,000 taels." Feng Zhiyao was immediately stunned. His original envy and jealousy immediately turned into deep hatred. He looked at Han Mingxi as if he was looking at a tall mountain of gold. More importantly, that mountain of gold belonged to someone else. No wonder so many people in this world like to open casinos. It was simply a matter of small capital and huge profits. No, Han Mingxi didn't even need the capital. It was simply a matter of no capital and huge profits. Han Mingxi sighed with some regret. It's a pity that Prince Ding and Genom of Gojosian both agreed to have a duel in private. If there was a duel or something, it would have been announced to the entire De Chu state or Xiling 2 months in advance. Then, not to mention 500,000 taels, he might even have gotten 5 million taels. Losing such a huge opportunity to make money made Han Mingxi's heart ache. Perhaps the members of the Han family were born with a talent for making money. Over the past year, Han Mingxi felt that he could gradually understand his elder brother's personality when he was dying for money. Feng Zhiyao glared at him with dissatisfaction for a long time before saying casually, "Prince wants you to give him the money as soon as possible." Hearing this, Han Mingxi was furious. He stared at Feng Zhiyao with a vigilant expression and said, "Why should I? This is the money I earned myself." Feng Zhiyao sneered, "Don't be silly. If Prince hadn't admitted to a draw in front of everyone in the end, do you think you could have won? Prince said that he would only take half of your money." Seeing how Genom of Gojosian vomited blood on the spot, if Prince insisted that he had won, no one would have been able to object. When this matter was brought up, Han Mingxi's anger subsided. He asked curiously, what did Prince Ding say to Genom of Gojosian in the end? Although his martial arts weren't very good, he still had some knowledge. Originally, Genom of Gojosian hadn't been injured much after the last palm strike. At least, he hadn't vomited blood on the spot. After Prince Ding said something to Genom of Gojosian's ear, he saw a mouthful of blood spurt out from Genom of Gojosian's mouth. It was clearly because he was angry. Chapter 470. Feng Zhiyao said lazily, "How would I know? Give me the money, I don't have time to count money with you." "So, you're here to ask me for money on behalf of Prince Ding?" Han Mingxi said hatefully. If he had known this was his intention, he would have sent someone to chase him out when he entered the door. Feng Zhiyao raised his eyebrows and laughed. What's the problem? Otherwise, I'll tell everyone in the Mahist army that you and Prince Ding were secretly colluding to control the outcome of the battle. The Mahist army didn't dare to cause trouble for Prince Ding, but they could definitely trample Han Mingxi to death. Thinking of those martial artists who had lost money and were full of resentment, Han Mingxi was angry, but he didn't dare to say anything. He angrily took out 250,000 taels from the table and gave it to Feng Zhiyao. After putting away the money, Feng Zhiyao stood up and bid farewell with satisfaction. Prince Ding had agreed to return his 800 taels to him. He wasn't greedy, as long as he didn't lose money. Inside the Han residence, while Han Mingxi was complaining about the large decrease in his income, Mo Xiuyao was sitting in his study. When he saw the banknotes that Feng Zhiyao brought to him, a satisfied smile appeared on his face. Feng Zhiyao looked at him in confusion and asked, Han Mingxi's 250,000 taels, as well as the rest of the bets in the city, adds up to 400,000 taels. Ah Yao, what do you need so much money for? Most importantly, Prince Ding couldn't find money anywhere. Why did he need to use this method to earn money? Mo Xiuyao looked at him leisurely and said, who placed the most bets? Feng Zhiyao smiled and said, do you still need to ask? Of course it's the envoys and nobles from various countries. No matter how many commoners there are in Ruyang City, how many of them can there be? I secretly asked around. Mo Jingli bet a total of 50,000 taels that Genom of Gojosian would win. Well. Princess Anqi also bet 30,000 taels, but she bet on you, Prince. These were the people who were not on bad terms with the Mahist army. As for the West Hill people and the northern tribes, such as the 7th Prince, wouldn't they bet on Genom of Gojosian? Even if it was just for the sake of vindication, they wanted to overwhelm the Prince Ding mansion in terms of momentum. Unfortunately, they did not know that in the end, it was Prince who killed them all. Mo Xiuyao said, then what about the money for Xiaobao's 1-month-old celebration? Don't tell me the Prince Ding mansion is going to pay for it. Feng Zhiyao was speechless. Shouldn't the Prince Ding mansion's crown prince's 1-month-old birthday party be hosted by the Prince Ding mansion? Prince, there should be a limit to how stingy you can be, okay? Mo Xiuyao didn't care about his subordinates' silent curses. Why would he use his own money to entertain those idiots that he didn't like? He waved his hand and said, go, transfer the money directly to Zhou Yu. Isn't he in charge of all these things? If there's any money left, just treat it as a red packet to the people in the city. Feng Zhiyao silently admired him in his heart. Prince, not only did you beat up Genom of Gojosian to vent your anger, but you also earned back the money needed to host the little crown prince's 1-month-old birthday party. How could you use the leftover money to buy people's hearts? Compared to you, Han Mingxi's ability to earn money was simply trash. The entire Ruyang city was in an uproar for nearly half a month. Prince Ding's 1-month-old birthday party was finally held as scheduled. In fact, the so-called banquets, whether it was a 1-month-old birthday party, a wedding party, or even a coronation party, were all the same. The only difference was the size of the party. The banquet this time was the same as the previous one. It was still held on the tower in the east of Ruyang City. When Mo Xiuyao held Yili's hand and walked up to the main seat on the tower, everyone couldn't help but be stunned on the spot. Mo Xiuyao, who always wore a silver half-mask, finally took off the mask that had accompanied him for nearly 10 years. However, what was exposed in front of everyone's eyes was not the hideous scars and face that they had originally expected. Under the candlelight, silvery white hair casually draped behind his back. Only a silver ribbon casually tied up the hair. Under the cover of a few strands of silver hair was Mo Xiuyao's handsome and upright face. The people sitting below couldn't even see a small wound, let alone a hideous scar. What was displayed in front of everyone was clearly a somewhat pale but absolutely handsome man. At this moment, the handsome man present was naturally not good. However, only the white-clothed young master Qinchin, Su Qinchin, could be compared with the unreachable white-haired man who was dressed in a dark purple noble robe on the high platform. However, young master Qinchin's expression was indifferent. His white robe made him look like a celestial being who had descended, as clear as a lotus and as quiet as the moon. However, the white-haired man was like the sharpest sword, the most noble and gorgeous jewel, the coldest and most icy snow at the peak of a mountain. Even his smile seemed to carry a frightening chill and pressure. As expected of Prince Ding. With such elegance, who else in the world but Princess Ding is a match for him? Even though her heart was tied to Su Qinchin, Princess Anqi couldn't help but sigh as she looked at Mo Xiaoyao. Hearing this, Mo Xiaoyao raised his head and looked at Yi Li, who was standing side by side with Mo Xiaoyao. He smiled faintly, his eyes filled with gratification. When Li had been betrothed to Mo Xiaoyao, the Su family had felt guilty. Chapter 471. Mo Xiaoyao smiled faintly and said, naturally. Mr. Qing Yun personally bestowed the name to my son. Yu Chen Chen. Mo Yu Chen. In fact, many of the people present had already learned of Mo Xiaobao's name through various channels. But when it came from Mo Xiaoyao's mouth, it was a completely different concept. Nanzhao and Dechu states' culture and customs were completely different. They didn't feel much about it, only praising the good name. The northern tribes were barbarians beyond the Great Wall. Even if they learned from the Central Plains, it was still limited. The ones who were truly shocked were Genom of Gojoseon of Xiling and Mo Jingli of Dechu State. Yu Chen, such a name did not hide Mo Xiaoyao's expectations for this child or his own ambition. Mo Jingli looked up at Mo Xiaoyao, who was leisurely holding Yi Li and sitting on the high main seat. His heart surged. He had never understood what kind of mentality he had towards Mo Xiaoyao, but at this moment, he clearly understood how jealous he was of Mo Xiaoyao. Yes, it was jealousy. Even if they were on the same side, he didn't dare to openly give his child such a name. Therefore, Mo Xiaoyao's son was called Mo Yuchen, while his son could only be ranked in the royal family and be called Mo Yunshao. Even if they were on the same team as Mo Jingqi, Mo Xiaoyao could openly invite the dignitaries of various countries, just like a king. But he could only secretly contact the dignitaries of various countries. In the eyes of the dignitaries of various countries, Prince Ding and Prince Li were never on the same level. Needless to say, the beautiful and elegant woman in Mo Xiaoyao's arms should have been his wife. However, even if his heart was filled with jealousy, he could only sit quietly below and watch Mo Xiaoyao's glory and pride. Sitting beside Mo Jingli, Yi Ying naturally saw Mo Jingli's expression. A mocking smile appeared on her lips. She looked up at Yi Li, but her eyes were filled with bitterness. In the past, she had felt incomparably proud that she had pulled Yi Li into the Li Palace. Occasionally, she would even feel a trace of sympathy for her half-sister who had joined the Prince Ding mansion. But now, they were both princesses. One of them sat above millions of people, controlled the huge Mahist army in the Prince Ding mansion, and had all the love and sincerity of the most excellent husband. She had been imprisoned in the capital with a sick and weak child. Now that she had finally escaped, her husband had many wives and concubines by his side. She had almost lost her place. Who was the one who needed sympathy? Mo Yuchen. Good name. Jinan King's gaze lingered on the child in Yi Li's arms for a moment before he praised. Mo Xiaoyao was not polite and calmly replied, "It is a good name." Yilu Yi stood up and smiled. Prince Ding's Shitzi is 1 month old. I specially brought a gift from the northern tribes for Shitzi. I hope Prince Ding will not dislike it. Mo Xiaoyao looked down at Yellow Yi and smiled faintly. Seventh prince has come from afar. How can I be so rude? I thank seventh prince on behalf of my son. Yellow Yi smiled and raised his hand to blow a strange whistle in the air. With a whistling sound in the air, a black shadow rushed down from the air and headed straight for where Mo Xiaoyao and Yili were sitting. The people below the stage could not help but exclaim. When the black shadow appeared under the light of the fire, it could be seen that it was not black, but a large snow-white bird. It spread its wings and a pair of sharp claws flashed under the light of the fire as it rushed towards the three people on the stage. In the midst of the crowd's exclamations, the large white bird seemed to have hit something and stopped a few feet away from the two people. Then it continued to charge forward. But there was clearly nothing in front of it, as if there was an invisible wall in front of it. At this time, the crowd could see that it was actually a large white eagle. The white eagle was blocked by an invisible barrier and could not get close to Yili and Mo Xiaoyao. But it did not want to leave and instead desperately charged forward and cried out. Yili slightly frowned and reached out to cover Mo Xiaobao's ears. She coldly stared at the white eagle and said, "Shut up." The coldness was so strong that even the proud white eagle could not help but tremble. Then it cried out even louder. Mo Xiaoyao sneered. "Impudent." With a flick of his wide sleeves, even the valiant eagle was caught by him and thrown out. The direction it was thrown just happened to be where Yellow Yi was sitting. Seeing the white eagle being thrown without any resistance, Yellow Yi could only get up and quickly retreat a few steps. The white eagle just happened to land on Yellow Yi's empty chair. The dizzy white eagle couldn't tell the difference between a person and a person. As soon as it got up, it charged towards Yellow Yi. Yellow Yi was shocked. This white eagle was the most ferocious bird in the northern militant grassland. Even wolves were afraid of it. If one was scratched by its claws, even if they did not die, they would lose half their life. Yellow Yi hurriedly blew his whistle in an attempt to control the white eagle, but the white eagle had just been thrown to the ground by Mo Xiaoyao and was seeing stars. When it heard the whistle, it habitually rushed forward. Yellow Yi had no choice but to use his qinggong to retreat to the side. Thus everyone watched as Yellow Yi was chased around by the white eagle they sent over. They could only look at each other, not knowing whether to laugh or pretend they did not see anything. Mo Xiaoyao squinted his eyes to enjoy the farce in front of him. Yili held Mo Xiaobao and also indifferently looked at the little fellow who was occasionally reaching out to tease him. Mo Xiaoyao's roll and toss just now was not that simple. Yili was sitting beside him and clearly saw Mo Xiaoyao sprinkle some strange medicinal powder on the white eagle's body. Although she did not know what it was, she could make a guess based on the white eagle's behavior. The best part was that the white eagle was flying around. Even if they caught it later, they might not be able to find any medicinal powder on its body. More importantly, the white eagle was sent over by the northern militant people. Even if there was anything, it was their own business. Seeing Yellow Yi being chased around by the dizzy white eagle, Yili faintly smiled. "All right, come and take down the seventh prince's gift." "Yes, princess." Two shadow guards stepped out from the crowd and attacked the white eagle from the left and right. If the white eagle was flying in the air, they naturally would not be able to catch it. But the white eagle's body was heavy and could not fly. After a few rounds, the two worked together to capture the white eagle and lock it in a sturdy cage sent over by the people below. Only then did everyone let out a sigh of relief. Yellow Yi made such a big joke in front of the nobles of the various countries. Seeing the white eagle that was angrily banging against the cage and trying to escape being taken away, Yellow Yi's face darkened to a frightening degree. Everyone looked at his sorry state and whispered to each other. The people from the Prince Ding mansion had to restrain themselves out of respect for the host. The envoys from the other countries were not so reserved. A few people from Xiling were even convulsing with laughter. This made Yelu Ye's mood even more gloomy. Yili handed Imo Xiaobao over to the nanny beside her and said with a smile, "It was just a small accident, don't mind it. Prince Yelu, why don't you go change your clothes?" Chapter 472. Yelu Hong nodded and said, "Princess is right. Seventh brother accidentally disturbed the prince. Princess, please forgive him. Seventh brother, go quickly." Yelu Hong and Yelu Yi had always been at odds with each other in the northern tribes. It was an understatement to say that they wanted to kill each other. But now that they were in the Dechu state, they had no intention of fighting each other. Yelu Hong only gave a faint reminder. Yelu Ye's expression was ugly as he cupped his hands towards Yili and Imo Xiuyao. He turned and left to change his clothes. The little episode just now did not affect everyone's mood. It was still Yelu Hong who stood up and smiled. Since seventh younger brother is the first to present a gift, this prince represents the northern tribes and imperial father to prepare a gift for the little heir. I hope that Prince Ding and Princess Consort will not dislike it. Yelu Hong waved his hand and two men from the northern tribes came forward with a brocade box. Once the box was opened, a golden light lit up the entire banquet and dazzled the eyes of all the guests. There was also an eagle in the brocade box, but it was different from the white eagle that was charging around. This was a golden eagle. It was almost the same size as the white eagle and was cast from gold. It was lifelike. Even the eyes of the golden eagle were inlaid with two green gemstones. Just by looking at the weight of the two men from the northern tribes, one could tell that this was definitely not a gold-plated object. It was a golden eagle cast from real gold. Even though there were many gold mines in the northern tribes, this gift from the northern tribes was definitely worth it. Imo Xiuyao nodded and smiled. "Thank you, Crown Prince of the northern tribes, for your generous gift." With a wave of his hand, someone immediately came forward to take the box. Yelu Hong did not mind and smiled faintly as he returned to his seat. Afterwards, the envoys from various countries presented their own gifts. The generals of the Prince Ding mansion did not dare to fall behind and each presented a gift for the crown prince. Imo Xiuyao didn't have too many thoughts. Even when the king of Jinan sent him 4 beauties of West Hill, Imo Xiuyao accepted them all without blinking. Everyone looked at Prince Ding and Princess Ding with a strange expression. Yili took a sip of the wine and laughed softly. "Prince's luck with women is quite good." Imo Xiuyao snorted and laughed. "To be able to marry Miss Li as my wife, I naturally have good luck with women." Yili raised her eyebrows slightly. "Then what does Prince plan to do with those 10 beauties of West Hill?" Imo Xiuyao said indifferently, "After receiving so many gifts tonight, we can't not return the favor, right?" As for Yelu Yi, Yelu Hong, Imo Jingli, and Anxi, Princess Anxi was out of the question. Why not just send a few of them? Do you think they can refuse Ai's gift in return? Even if they didn't want it, they could only deal with it privately. They absolutely couldn't embarrass him in public. Hearing this, Yi Li's lips couldn't help but twitch. Mingxi and Feng San are right. Prince is becoming more and more stingy. Not only did he bet on his son's 1-month-old birthday party, he even had to pay for the gifts given by others. Imo Xiuyao laughed. "Miss Li, you can't blame me for being stingy. Who asked us to have so many people in the Mahist army to eat and drink? Also, 2 days ago, I saw a set of beautiful jewelry from the western regions. It suits Miss Li very well. It cost me a total of 60,000 taels of silver." "Oh. For me?" Hearing the price tag of 60,000 taels of silver, Yi Li frowned slightly. That was 60,000 taels of silver, not 60,000 yuan. But hearing that Imo Xiuyao gave it to her, she was still somewhat happy. There was no woman who didn't like a gift from her husband. Imo Xiuyao nodded and complained, "These people really don't know anything. What does a brat like Miss Li know? It's Miss Li who has to work hard to give birth, okay? If they want to give a gift, they should give it to Miss Li. Everyone in the hall looked strangely at the harmonious couple on the main seat. Prince Ding had accepted 10 beauties from West Hill in front of so many people, but Princess Ding didn't seem unhappy at all. She even looked happier than before. What was going on? It didn't look like she was pretending to be happy. Before anyone could say anything, a sharp voice suddenly came from below the city tower. The imperial edict has arrived. Everyone was stunned. Most people couldn't react to what was going on. Where did the imperial edict come from in the middle of the night? The city gates should have been closed by now, right? Also, the emperor of Dechu state was very strange. He didn't even show up before the celebration for Prince Ding. Now, the banquet was halfway through before he came out to scare people. Many people turned to look at Mo Jingli, only to see that Mo Jingli was also frowning with a confused expression. Clearly, he didn't understand what was going on either. Yi Li and Mo Xiaoyao looked calm and uncomfortable. Mo Xiaoyao's smile deepened. He casually glanced at Su Hongyu and Su Qingchen sitting below the stage. Su Hongyu nodded imperceptibly, while Su Qingchen smiled faintly. Not long after, the people who came to deliver the edict had walked up the city tower. The person in the lead was wearing a second-rank court robe. He was the Minister of Rights. The people behind him were also officials from the Ministry of Rights. There were also a few imperial bodyguards following behind. They looked solemn and serious. The Minister of Rights held the imperial edict with both hands and raised it above his head. He said loudly, "The imperial edict has arrived." Mo Xiaoyao received the imperial edict. Everyone was in an uproar. They weren't here to celebrate Prince Ding's 1-month-old birthday. They were clearly here to cause trouble. Mo Jingli led Yi Li and the others to kneel and receive the imperial edict. Although he didn't like his older brother the emperor, he was still Prince Li of Dechu state. He still had to act on the surface. As for the others, they weren't so polite. The generals and officials of the Mahist army pretended not to hear. They continued drinking and chatting. The so-called imperial edict in the northwest was worse than a piece of paper. As for the envoys from the Western Hill and Northern tribes, they looked like they were watching a show. Mo Xiaoyao, who was sitting on the main seat, clearly didn't have any intention of rising to receive the imperial edict. As a result, only Mo Jingli and the others were kneeling. Mo Jingli was secretly angry. He couldn't help but curse his brother the emperor for being so meddlesome. Clearly, the Minister of Rights didn't expect this situation. He looked at Mo Xiaoyao, who was leaning lazily on the high platform and looking down at him. The Minister of Rights said in a low voice, "Mo Xiaoyao, receive the imperial edict." "Read it," Mo Xiaoyao said lightly. The Minister of Rights frowned. He was about to speak when Mo Xiaoyao sat up and stared at him. "Either read the thing in your hand, or take it and get out of Ruyang City. I am in a good mood tonight. I don't want your worthless lives." Impudent. The Minister of Rights was so angry that his face turned red. He pointed at Mo Xiaoyao and couldn't say anything for a while. Mo Xiaoyao had already been stripped of his title by the emperor, but he still dared to be so arrogant. He clearly didn't care about the court or the emperor. "Your Highness Prince Li." The Minister of Rights wasn't an idiot. He naturally knew that he didn't have the ability to go against Mo Xiaoyao. He could only look at Mo Jingli, who was kneeling on the side. Mo Jingli's face was gloomy. He felt that he had lost all face because of this emperor brother. He stood up and looked coldly at the Minister of Rights. "Didn't you hear? Do you really want to be thrown out without reading the imperial edict?" The Minister of Rights' face twisted a few times. In the end, he swallowed his anger. After all, the emperor had sent him here to pass on this imperial edict. If he was thrown out without reading it, then he definitely wouldn't have a good time when he returned to the capital. Taking a deep breath, the Minister of Rites unfolded the bright yellow silk and read aloud, "By the will of the heavens, the Emperor decrees, Mo Xiaoyao, a commoner, is impudent and presumptuous. He has raised an army for his own sake and has conferred himself the title of prince. He has rebelled against his superiors. Yunzhou's Su family has colluded with rebels and conspired to overthrow the country. Mo Xiaoyao has stripped them of their imperial surname and demoted them to lowly commoners. Yunzhou's Su family is to be executed." Chapter 473. The entire city gate tower was silent. Even the voices of the peddlers on the street not far from the city gate tower could be heard clearly. Everyone couldn't help but look at the Ministry of Rites official holding the imperial decree like they were looking at a madman. What was the use of that? Was Mo Xiaoyao someone that you could demote as you wished? Even if Mo Jingqi wrote 1,000 imperial decrees to throw Mo Xiaoyao into the dust, he would still be high up in the northwest and look down on the nobles. Was the Su family someone that you could execute just because you wanted to? Why don't you execute a member of the Su family first? Just by looking at the Su family sitting in the front row, it was clear how unreliable the Dechu State Emperor's imperial decree was. Mo Jingqi obviously knew that this imperial decree was useless. Therefore, he didn't really send people to execute the Su family today, nor did he really want to do anything to Mo Xiaoyao. He just wanted Mo Xiaoyao to lose face in front of the heroes and nobles of the world. Ha! A burst of clear laughter suddenly came from the main seat. Mo Xiaoyao leaned back in his chair as if he had heard something very funny. He laughed so hard that his entire body fell back into the chair. When he finally finished laughing, Mo Xiaoyao leaned against Yi Li's shoulder and sat up. He looked down at the Ministry of Rites official who was forcing himself to be calm and raised his eyebrows. "Take his imperial surname? Did that idiot Mo Jingqi forget that I didn't have his surname? I just happened to have the same ancestor as him. Impudent! You dare to be so disrespectful to the emperor." Although the Ministry of Rites official was angry, his face was also a bit embarrassed. The Dechu state was founded on filial piety. Other than being bestowed the imperial surname due to great contributions, no one could change it, including the emperor. Even if someone really committed the crime of having their entire family executed, they couldn't casually change the criminal's surname. Moreover, Mo Xiaoyao's surname was originally Mo, and it wasn't a surname bestowed upon him by the emperor. In addition, although the two families came from the same source, after the founding of Taizu, they established their own ancestral temples. Mo Xiaoyao and Mo Jingqi had the same surname, but they could no longer be considered to have the same ancestors. Mo Jingqi had the power to expel many of the prince's relatives from the clan, but that did not extend to Mo Xiaoyao. However, no matter how awkward it was, he could not tolerate Mo Xiaoyao calling the emperor an idiot in front of everyone. Mo Xiaoyao faintly raised his eyebrows, completely ignoring the furious Minister of Rites. Those who were sent by Mo Jingqi to the northwest to die were obviously not important characters. He was most likely the newly appointed Minister of Rites. Mo Xiaoyao did not bicker with him, but the generals of the Mahist army could not tolerate it. They all opened their mouths and cursed angrily. The men who came out of the military camp naturally did not have the elegance of the scholars in the imperial court who scolded people. They dared to use all kinds of vulgarities. Mo Jingqi had probably never been scolded this much in his entire life. Mo Xiaoyao leisurely enjoyed the curses of the soldiers and did not have any intention of restraining them. After all, Mo Xiaobao's 1-month birthday banquet was over. The rest of the banquet was time for entertainment. Below, Lei Tingfing sat next to Genom of Gojoseon and furrowed his brows. In a low voice, he asked, "Fu Wang, what do you think Prince Ding means by this?" If word of Mo Jingqi's ruckus spread out, Mo Xiuyao's face would not look good. If Mo Xiuyao wanted to stop this matter, those officials would not be able to enter. Now, looking at Mo Xiuyao's appearance, not only did he not intend to stop it, he even seemed to be adding fuel to the fire. This made Lei Tingfeng somewhat unable to understand what Mo Xiuyao wanted to do. Genom of Gojoseon slightly narrowed his eyes and glanced at Mo Xiuyao, who was sitting on the main seat with a smile on his face but a hint of coldness in his eyes. His gaze then landed on Yili. Yili quietly sat next to Mo Xiuyao. Her gaze was indifferent as she watched the farce in front of her, as if she did not have any intention of getting angry. Genom of Gojoseon naturally knew that Yili was not a woman without a temper. In reality, it was just that she rarely lost her temper. Once she was truly angry, not to mention women, most men in this world would not be able to bear it. The Su family seated below also seemed to be rather calm. Even the third and fifth young masters of the Su family, who had the worst tempers, sat quietly and drank wine, as if this matter had nothing to do with them. After a moment of silence, Genom of Gojoseon's heart skipped a beat. In a low voice, he said, "I'm afraid Mo Xiuyao and the Dechu state will truly fall out." This was not good news for West Hill. West Hill and even the northern tribes and southern Zhao had been sparing no effort in trying to drive a wedge between the Dechu state's royal family and the Prince Ding mansion. But they definitely did not wish for the two to truly fall out. If the Prince Ding mansion and the Mahist army were said to be an extremely sharp sword, then the Dechu state was a somewhat rusty sheath. But when necessary, it could restrain the actions of the Prince Ding mansion and the Mahist army. It could allow the people who were forced into a corner by the sharpness of this sword to have room to breathe and a chance to counterattack. Just like when Mo Xiuyao led the army to conquer the south. If not for the imperial court restraining him, the Nanzhao kingdom would have been destroyed in name, even if it had not been destroyed. And once the Mahist army truly broke away from the control of the Dechu state, it would be like an unsheathed sword. When it wanted to swing somewhere, it would inevitably bring destruction and bloodshed, and no one could stop it. Lei Tingfeng was startled. As the crown prince of West Hill's Genom of Gojoseon, he could naturally understand the crux of the matter. But he did not understand why Mo Xiuyao chose this time to break off relations with the Dechu state. Previously, when the Mahist army struggled on the battlefield and was stabbed in the back by Mo Jingqi, Mo Xiuyao did not do anything. After Yili fell off the cliff, although Mo Xiuyao killed 7,000 soldiers and occupied the northwest, he did not really do anything. Even when Mo Jingqi stripped him of his throne, he did not care. But today, looking at the situation in front of him, Lei Tingfeng understood that Mo Xiuyao did not intend to continue enduring. Was it because of the Su family? He looked at the calm members of the Su family sitting across from him. From the white-haired Master Qingyun to the oldest fifth young master of the Su family, each of them had an extraordinary aura. But if it was said that Mo Xiuyao officially broke off relations with Mo Jingqi because of them, it would not make sense. After all, the Su family had been in the northwest for many days. Genom of Gojoseon laughed coldly and said lightly, "Mo Xiuyao is right. Mo Jingqi is really an idiot." He fell into Mo Xiuyao's trap. Mo Xiuyao was waiting for him to make the first move. With the pride of the Mahist army, it would be strange if they did not make trouble after being humiliated by Mo Jingqi. Amidst the shouting and cursing, Mo Xiuyao calmly raised his hand. The shouting and cursing of the Mahist army immediately quieted down. Everyone looked at Mo Xiuyao, who slowly stood up from his seat, and Yili, who stood up with him. The two of them stood side by side high up in the air, making everyone feel as if they were looking up to them. Mo Xiuyao smiled coldly as he looked at the Minister of Rites, whose face was green with anger. Then his gaze swept over Mo Jingli. Mo Jingli's heart suddenly tightened. He stared closely at Mo Xiuyao. The hands behind his back also secretly clenched. Mo Xiuyao, what are you trying to do? Mo Xiuyao said, I know what Mo Jingqi wants to say. Since everyone is here today, I also have some things to say. After you hear it, I will bring it back to Mo Jingqi without missing a single word. Chapter 474. Behind him, Shuijing held a roll of bright yellow silk and walked over. Mo Xiuyao casually took it and looked at it. Without even opening it, he casually threw it down and said, Feng San, read it. Feng San, who was originally still drinking with Zhang Qilan, jumped up from the ground. His beautiful red clothes flipped in the air, and like a red cloud, he landed in the center of the hall. In his hand, he was holding the bright yellow silk. Mo Jingqi is muddle-headed and tyrannical, framing loyal people. As an emperor, he does not care about the stability of the country. First, he colluded with the enemy country to plot against the late Prince Ding Mo Xiuwen, causing the late emperor to die at the border. Tens of thousands of innocent Mahist army died. Then, he colluded with the enemy country to kill the Mahist army. The Chu state's imperial family and the Mahist army have a grudge against each other for killing their father and brothers, and then for framing and slandering them. The Mahist army has been loyal to the Chu state for generations. Today, they have suffered such humiliation and hatred, causing their ancestors to be ashamed and their souls to be unable to rest in peace. Now, with Feihong Pass as the boundary, the Mahist army and the Chu state will be separated. All ties will be severed. Feng Zhiyao read out his own words on the silk, which seemed to contain internal energy. Not to mention the originally quiet city gate tower, even the noisy streets in the distance instantly became quiet. Feng Zhiyao's clear and heavy voice immediately rang through half of Ruyang City. The Chu state's imperial family killed my father and brothers, and humiliated me as a hero. I and the Chu state's imperial family will sever all ties and have nothing to do with each other. Finally, Mo Xiuyao's voice reverberated throughout the entire Ruyang city. On the city gate tower, the Mahist army soldiers stood up and praised the prince's brilliance. On the side, Mo Jingli's expression was complicated. The Minister of Rights, whose face was originally ashen, was now pale and on the verge of collapse. Mo Xiuyao's resolute voice made it clear that the Mahist army that had protected the Chu state for over 100 years would no longer have any connection with the Chu state. Although the northwest of the Chu state had the Mahist army as a barrier to stop the West Hill, the black figure that had never retreated for 100 years could no longer be seen at the border between Nanzhao and the northern tribes. The Mahist army had protected the Chu state for 100 years, but it had finally come to an end tonight. No one could say anything, not even Mo Jingli or Chu state's officials. The entire tower was silent. Everyone looked up at the young man and woman who were standing side by side on the main seat. Everyone thought the same thing in their hearts: this chaotic world is really coming. After that, the banquet was the usual music and dance. However, no one present paid any attention to the enchanting dancers or the moving music. Almost as soon as Mo Xiuyao and Yili left, all the guests left with them. It was important to go back and discuss this matter. At this time, no one was in the mood to enjoy the wine and dance. The next morning, the announcement made by Prince Ding on the city gate tower the night before was quickly sent out by various people in all directions through various channels. But while they were shocked, the envoys of Xiling, northern tribes, Nanzhao, and the Chu state did not leave the next morning. In the Prince Ding mansion, the meeting hall was filled with people early in the morning. Many of them had dark circles under their eyes. It was clear that they had not slept well. Mo Xiuyao and Yili walked into the hall side by side. Everyone hurriedly stood and bowed. Greetings to the prince, Wang Fei. The two sat down. Mo Xiuyao smiled faintly and said, "No need for formalities. Everyone, sit as you please. General Zhang and Feng San, what happened?" Did you not sleep well last night? Feng Zhiyao rolled his eyes. Last night, the envoys of the 4 countries and the common people were not the only ones who had been frightened by their prince. The one who had received the real surprise was him, Feng San. The prince had not given him any notice beforehand. When he received the silk and opened it, if he did not have great willpower, he almost threw the thing in his hand out. He barely managed to calmly read the words on it. No one knew that Feng Zhiyao's hands were still trembling when he returned to his seat. Feng San felt that he had been deeply hurt. Mo Xiaoyao looked with a smile at his subordinates who all had different expressions. He smiled and said, "What? Are you all frightened? Are you afraid? The prince should have done this long ago. What do we have to be afraid of?" Lu Jingxian said in a clear voice. The others all agreed. In an instant, the hall was filled with noise and excitement. "Prince, since you've decided to break off relations with the Dechu state, the misunderstanding that the people of the Northwest, and even the Dechu state, have towards the prince and the Prince Ding mansion can be resolved," Su Hongyu said mildly. Mo Xiaoyao nodded. "What do you think, teacher?" Su Hongyu said, "Strike first to gain the initiative. Clearly announce the grudge between the royal family of the Dechu state and the Prince Ding mansion to the world. Although most of the people are illiterate, they are not unreasonable." Feng Zhiyao agreed, "What Mr. Hongyu said is extremely true. If we announce it to the world now, by the time the news reaches the Chu capital last night, the whole world will know about Imo Jingqi. This young master wants to see how he will turn the tide." Everyone agreed with Su Hongyu's words. Back then, when Imo Jingqi tried his best to smear the Prince Ding mansion's reputation, the Prince Ding mansion did not refute him at all. They had been waiting for this day. The more the people hated and misunderstood the Prince Ding mansion, the angrier they would be when they learned the truth. Of course, this anger was directed at Imo Jingqi. Mo Xiaoyao and Yili naturally didn't have any objections. Mo Xiaoyao looked at Su Hongyu and said, "We'll have to trouble Mr. Hongyu for this." Su Hongyu was a great scholar whose name was known throughout the world. Leaving this matter to him was naturally twice the result with half the effort. Su Hongyu nodded in agreement. He dismissed the high-ranking officials who had entered the mansion early in the morning, leaving behind only a few of his trusted subordinates and the governor of Ruyang City, Zhou Yu. Although Zhou Yu was still young, although he was not outstanding in handling the government affairs, he still followed the rules and did not make any mistakes. Considering his age and experience, it was already excellent. Furthermore, his strict and serious conduct made Mo Xiaoyao and Yili very satisfied. "Lord Zhou, have the envoys of Xiling and the northern tribes bid farewell today?" Yili asked. Zhou Yu stood up and said respectfully, "Princess, currently, we have not received any letters of farewell from the envoys. However, this morning, Genom of Gojoseon of Xiling, the 7th prince of the northern tribes, and Prince Li of Dechu state all left the city early in the morning, saying that they wanted to enjoy the scenery of the northwest." Yili smiled and said, "Let them go. The envoys of the various countries are guests. We must make them feel at home. I hope that Lord Zhou will take care of this. If there are any problems, just send someone to the mansion to report. Of course, if there are people who do not abide by the rules and want to cause trouble in the northwest, Lord Zhou need not be polite. The 2,500 Black Cloud cavalry stationed outside the city will be at your disposal at any time." Speaking of the organization of the Black Cloud cavalry, Yili couldn't help but frown. She was used to numbers in the past. This variety of army names made her dizzy. The Black Cloud cavalry had about 50,000 people. They were divided into the Eagle, Lion, and Tiger armies. Each army had about 16 to 17,000 people. Each army was divided into 5 divisions, each division about 3,000 people. The one stationed near Ruyang were the Eagle Army. Zhou Yu's expression changed. With his age and experience, he had never thought that he would be so trusted by the prince and princess. He hurriedly said, "Prince and princess, please do not worry. This subordinate will not betray the prince and princess's trust." Mo Xiaoyao clearly saw his thoughts. He nodded and said, "I do not like to use people based on experience and age. Earlier, you were able to support the people of Ruyang City. I and Princess have entrusted Ruyang City to you. You only need to worry about the formalities." Zhou Yu suppressed the surging emotions in his heart and respectfully said, "This subordinate accepts the order. This subordinate will leave." Seeing Zhou Yu turn and leave, Su Qingchen smiled and said, "Prince has managed his subordinates well. No wonder the Mahist army is so united." Mo Xiaoyao smiled and said, "Young Master Qingchen is too polite. I subordinates are all rough people. To be honest, I don't have many civil officials. At the time, I had no choice but to bring up Zhou Yu. Fortunately, he is diligent and strict. He is not bad. In the future, I will have to trouble young Master Qingchen and the two sirs." Su Qingchen raised an eyebrow. His smile was light and calm. "Prince trusts the Su family." Mo Xiaoyao raised an eyebrow and said, "If he doesn't trust one, why is he doing this? Also, if even the Su family doesn't trust one, who else can? You can't expect I to do everything personally, right? These people in the Mahist army, it's not a problem to have them lead troops to fight, but to have them handle government affairs is more difficult than taking their lives." Chapter 475. On the side, Lu Jingxian nodded in agreement. When they had just taken over the northwest, a large number of officials had been replaced. These generals had also been in charge of local affairs for a period of time. Those days were simply unbearable to look back on. On the side, Lu Jingxian nodded in agreement. When they had just taken over the northwest, a large number of officials had been replaced. These generals had also been in charge of local affairs for a period of time. Those days were simply unbearable to look back on. After chatting and laughing for a while, everyone's expression became serious and they began to talk about serious matters. Su Hongyu asked, "Now that the Northwest has really drawn a clear line with the Dechu state, what does the prince plan to do first?" Mo Xiaoyao respectfully said, "Please guide me, teacher." Su Hongyu shook his head. "Prince doesn't need to be so polite. I'm sure the prince knows what to do. There's no need for this old man to guide you. This old man's opinion is that the first thing to do is to reunify the positions of the officials, as well as the prince's real position in the northwest for the Mahist army." Mo Xiaoyao was silent for a moment, then said, "Reunifying the positions of the officials is imperative. But I don't understand the so-called position of the Mahist army and the northwest that teacher spoke of." Su Hongyu looked at him and said, "Now the northwest and the Dechu state no longer have anything to do with each other. So how does the prince plan for the future of the northwest and the Mahist army? Will each occupy a region and peacefully maintain the status quo? Or will you open up new territory and unify the world?" Su Hongyu said the words "unify the world" very softly, but in everyone's ears, it was as loud as thunder. Perhaps it wasn't appropriate to say this when they had just broken away from the Dechu state, but it was also the most realistic problem. The Mahist army had divided the northwest and was surrounded by enemies. If Mo Xiaoyao didn't have the ambition to open up new territory, then the northwest would one day have to choose a powerful country to rely on. If that was the case, it would be the same as walking down the same path as the Prince Ding mansion, or even worse than before. As such, the Mahist army could only move forward and not retreat. Moving forward, expanding the territory and unifying the world, this was the aspiration of the previous kings and generals of the Mahist army. However, due to the restraints of the royal family for many years, they always failed at the last minute. But at the same time, if Mo Xiuyao were to establish himself as emperor, no matter how many reasons he had, he would definitely be labeled as a traitor in the eyes of the world. The Prince Ding mansion had a grudge with the current emperor and the previous emperor for killing his father and brother. Why would they say anything when they broke off relations with the Dechu state? However, if they were to destroy the Dechu state, then they would inevitably be branded as traitors. Su Hongyu calmly looked at Mo Xiuyao. This young Prince Ding had experienced countless hardships, but at the same time, he also carried the glory and reputation of the Ding king's residence for nearly 100 years. Could he bear this kind of infamy and consequences? Mo Xiuyao suddenly let out a low laugh, looking at Su Hongyu with calm and determined eyes. Mo Xiuyao calmly smiled and said, "Mr. Hongyu, there is no need to test I. Since I can break off relations with the Dechu state, why should I not give up such a trivial reputation? The grudge of killing my father and brother, I will definitely get it back from Mo Xiuyao." Su Hongyu was silent for a moment, then stood and cupped his hands to Mo Xiuyao. "Prince, please give your orders." Mo Xiuyao was silent for a moment, then opened his mouth and said, "Change Ruyang City to Li City, and set the era name forever." Everyone was startled. Feng Zhiyao reminded, "Prince, the country name." Mo Xiuyao glanced at him and raised his brows with a smile. "Who said I want to set the country name?" Everyone was silent. What did it mean to change the era name but not the country name? Su Qingchen, who was sitting on the side and listening, raised his head and asked, "Prince, you mean to temporarily not ascend the throne?" Mo Xiuyao carelessly waved his hand and said, "The Northwest is just a small piece of land. Calling myself an emperor is just for my own amusement. Why should I do this for the so-called title of emperor? Under I's rule, if I say I am the king, then I am the king. If I say I am the emperor, then I am the emperor." Everyone understood. This era name was just to distinguish it from the Dechu state's era. Without an emperor, there would naturally be no country name. Seeing that everyone was still hesitant, Mo Xiuyao smiled and said, "Even if I want to establish a country, I can't be so shabby, right? The coronation ceremony was not cheap. Where is the imperial palace? Where is the imperial city? In such a small piece of land like the Northwest, I can't afford to hold a coronation ceremony. Everyone, just make do and save some money." Could it be that he wanted to learn from those idiots who dreamed of becoming emperors and casually occupy a small city to establish a country? If he couldn't unify the world, how could he, Mo Xiuyao, have the nerve to call himself an emperor? Su Hongyu sighed softly and nodded. "It is good that the prince has such ambitions. Let's do as the prince says." Su Hongyu sighed softly and nodded. "It is good that the prince has such ambitions. Let's do as the prince says." The day after Prince Ding's full moon banquet, a shocking thunderbolt was thrown from the Prince Ding mansion. With Ruyang City as the base, Prince Ding officially announced that he controlled 5 states and 17 cities to the west of Feihong Pass in the northwest. Ruyang City was changed to Glass City and the era name was changed to Yongding. From then on, the northwest to the west of Feihong Pass was officially separated from the Dechu state. In the guest house, Genom of Gojoseon was also startled when he heard the news from his subordinate. Glass City. Yongding. Mo Xiuyao has really made up his mind to not care about the Dechu state. Lei Dingfeng, who had just hurried back, put down his teacup and disdainfully pursed his lips. If I were Mo Xiuyao, it would be good enough if he didn't immediately send troops to kill his way into the Chu capital. Lei Dingfeng was both confused and disdainful of Mo Jingqi's self-destruction. Genom of Gojoseon glanced at his son and smiled faintly. "You look down on Mo Jingqi. Do you think that if you were him, you would do better than him?" Lei Dingfeng frowned. He knew that his father wouldn't ask such an obvious question for no reason. Genom of Gojosian also didn't really want his answer. He sighed softly and smiled. With subordinates like the Ding King residents, it isn't easy for any emperor. Mo Jingqi himself is a person with lofty ambitions, but he also knows that his abilities are mediocre. It would be strange if he didn't go crazy. Lei Dingfeng frowned. Mo Jingqi, as the emperor, is framing the Mahist army for his own selfishness still right? Genom of Gojosian smiled and shook his head. It's fine if you say it's right, but it's also not wrong if you say it's wrong. In Mo Jingqi's eyes, the Ding King residence is much more terrifying than the northern tribes and Xiling. If we want to invade the Dechu state, we will have to go through years of bitter battles. Right now, other than Nanzhao, the three countries are actually not that far apart in strength. But the Prince Ding mansion is different. Take Mo Lufang for example. With his prestige, as long as he revealed the slightest intention of becoming the emperor, do you believe that countless people would immediately rush forward to worship him as the emperor? This kind of person can take over the entire Dechu state without shedding a drop of blood. Do you think that he or the northern tribes in Xiling are more terrifying? But Lei Dingfeng wanted to refute. Genom of Gojosian interrupted his words. Do you want to say that Mo Lufang and the Prince Ding mansion don't have the ambition to rule the world? Lei Dingfeng hesitated for a moment before nodding. Genom of Gojosian smiled. If you are Mo Jingqi, do you really believe that the Prince Ding mansion won't pose a threat to you? Lei Dingfeng furrowed his brows in deep thought. He completely put himself in Mo Jingqi's shoes. After thinking for a long time, he raised his head, but his face was already ashen and his forehead was covered in sweat. Genom of Gojosian smiled in understanding. Do you understand now? The Prince Ding mansion's fault isn't that they are ambitious, but that they are too powerful. No emperor can tolerate such an existence. How can they tolerate others sleeping beside their bed? If the emperor himself is strong enough, he can still carefully maintain the balance and even suppress them. It's a pity, the royal family of the Dechu state is getting weaker with each generation, while Mo Lanyan's descendants are getting stronger with each generation. This is probably fate. Chapter 476. Lei Dingfeng bowed his head and said, "Thank you, Father, for your guidance." This child's thinking was too simple. Genom of Gojosian sighed softly and said, "You are still young." Even so, he still felt some regret. Tingfeng and Mo Xiuyao were about the same age, but in terms of ability and influence, he was far inferior to Mo Xiuyao. It wasn't that his son wasn't outstanding enough, but that Mo Xiuyao was too outstanding. Father, Mo Xiuyao's actions. Lei Dingfeng frowned and said, Mo Xiuyao doesn't seem to have any intention of ascending the throne. Genom of Gojosian nodded and said, if he had intended to ascend the throne, we wouldn't have come to Prince Ding's 1-month birthday banquet, but directly to the coronation ceremony. This is where Mo Xiuyao is smart. Just watch, after the news from Ruyang City spreads, the entire Dechu state will immediately lean toward the Prince Ding mansion. But if Mo Xiuyao were to ascend the throne at this time, it would be very different. In many things, going too far is as bad as not going far enough. This also shows that Mo Xiuyao is not only outstanding in ability, but also has enough patience. In this world, not everyone can withstand the temptation of the throne. Lei Dingfeng was silent. In the history books, there were countless people who claimed to be kings after occupying a small piece of land. Later generations would only find it comical and laughable. But if one was really among them, how many people could withstand the doubts of the throne? Lei Dingfeng knew in his heart that at least he couldn't. Should we take this opportunity to send troops? Genom of Gojosian raised his hand and said, send orders back to the border of Xiling. The entire army is to retreat 30 li, Leitingfing didn't understand. Father. Genom of Gojosian said in a low voice, let's negotiate with Mo Xiuyao. Leitingfing frowned. Mo Xiuyao's actions will definitely infuriate Mo Jingqi. Once Mo Jingqi sends his troops to the northwest, we will take advantage of the situation to invade. Why would father want to negotiate with Mo Xiuyao? Genom of Gojosian sneered disdainfully. Do you think Mo Xiuyao really dares to touch Mo Xiuyao? If he had the guts, he wouldn't have waited until today. So what if Mo Xiuyao didn't have that era name before? It was a fact that the Mahist army had occupied the northwest. Mo Jingqi had no lack of reason to send troops to suppress them, but did he dare to? At most, Mo Xiuyao would only send a few troops for show. For the time being, Mo Xiuyao wouldn't bother with him. When the time comes, the Mahist army will turn around and target us. Leitingfing said, our West Hill isn't afraid of the Mahist army. Genom of Gojosian smiled. That's right. We aren't afraid of the Mahist army. No matter how powerful the Mahist army is, they won't be able to wipe out the West Hill with just the strength of the Northwest. But if the northern tribes and the southern tribes interfere, will you be afraid? None of them were easy to deal with. They weren't the only ones who knew how to loot a burning house. Leitingfing was silent. The news of the Mahist army breaking off relations with the Dechu state spread like the wind throughout the entire Dechu state and the surrounding countries. The impact was so great that Mo Jingqi didn't expect it. Not only were the people who felt cheated dissatisfied with the court, but even the prince, who had given orders to various regions, began to feel restless. Not to mention the increasing mobilization of troops in the surrounding countries. Not to mention the northern tribes, even some of the small tribes in the north began to provoke them at the border. Perhaps the officials in the Chu capital were still angrily cursing, but the people at the borders of the Dechu state had personally experienced what losing the Mahist army meant to the Dechu state. Mo Xiuyao. What Mo Xiuyao, what a Prince Ding mansion. One day, I will execute your entire family. In the imperial study, Mo Jingqi crazily smashed the furnishings in the room. This time, he was completely helpless against Mo Xiuyao. Mo Xiuyao had thrown such a huge bomb at his son's 1-month birthday banquet. By the time the news reached the Chu capital, it would have spread throughout the world. Not to mention that Mo Jingqi wanted to refute or counterattack, there would be countless scholars who would collectively submit memorials to the court every day. Those memorials were more like questions than memorials. However, the evidence given by the Northwest was conclusive, and there were no flaws in the reasoning. No matter how he argued, it would be useless. Every day, when Mo Jingqi saw the memorials, he couldn't help but have a headache. In the anger of being cheated by the ruler and the worry of losing the Mahist army, these scholars and people almost forgot the righteousness of the Prince Ding Mansion's declaration of independence from the Dechu state. Come. Pass on Jin's decree. Immediately mobilize an army of 500,000 to suppress the traitor Mo Xiuyao. Mo Jingqi, who had lost his head in anger, roared loudly. Right now, he didn't want to think about anything. He only wanted to kill the Mahist army and kill everyone in the Prince Ding mansion. Only then would he be able to vent the hatred in his heart. Prime Minister Liu, who was standing in the corner, looked at Mo Jingqi's crazy appearance and frowned. He hesitated for a moment and advised, Your Majesty, the northern tribes are eyeing the border covetously. The border between the southwest and West Hill is not peaceful either. Also, Prince Ding. Before he could finish, Mo Jingqi interrupted him, It's the traitor Mo Xiuyao. Prime Minister Liu nodded and said, Mo Xiuyao sent 200,000 Mahist army to guard Feihong Pass. If we want to. I'm afraid it won't be that easy. Emperor, please reconsider. There were at least 400,000 Mahist army in the northwest. Although the military strength of the Dechu state was several times that of the Mahist army, there were only a few who could really compete with the Mahist army. If they wanted to conquer the Northwest, the Dechu state had to be prepared to gamble with the whole country. But no matter how they looked at it, it was obviously not worth it. How could Imo Jingchi not know this? It was because he understood this that he was even angrier. Get out! Get out! Imo Jingchi roared angrily. He grabbed something on the table and threw it over. Prime Minister Liu was old. Although the flying inkstone didn't hit him, he was still shocked. Taking a look at Imo Jingchi, who was supporting himself on the table with an angry face, Prime Minister Liu's eyes darkened. He quickly stepped out. In the Prince Ding mansion, Yili took the letter from Zhuo Jing and raised her eyebrows. The letter was sent by Tan Jiji. Naturally, it was to remind Yili that it was time to release Xu Manlin, who had been imprisoned by them for a long time. Although Xinyang and Dr. Lin had verified that the biluo flower they brought back from the Chu capital was real, Yili still didn't care about Xu Manlin and didn't release her before the medicine was developed. Zhuo Jing asked, "Princess, should we reply?" Yili folded the letter with a smile and put it back. She said with a smile, "Tell Tan Jiji that it's not that I don't want to release her, but that Princess Anxi of Nanzhao is now a guest in Li City. If she knows that the Saint of Nanjiang is here, it won't be good. Tell him to wait a few more days. As soon as Princess Anxi leaves the Northwest, I will release her immediately. Tell him to rest assured that we haven't mistreated Xu Manlin in the past few months." Zhuo Jing nodded. He thought for a while and asked, "These days, various forces have been secretly running around in the Northwest. Even the prince's mansion can't stay still. Should we release the news about the Imperial Jade Seal?" Yili nodded in agreement and said with a smile, "Otherwise, why would I see Tan Jiji in the Northwest? Let's spread the news about Tan Jiji's identity and the whereabouts of the Imperial Jade Seal. Also, he came to the Northwest to get the Imperial Jade Seal and the treasure. Since he released the news himself, let him enjoy it now." Zhuo Jing said with a smile, "Princess is wise." As long as he thought of Tan Jiji being chased by various forces, Zhuo Jing couldn't help but be in a good mood. It was easy to feel happy when others were unlucky. Chapter 477. Wang Fei, there's one more thing. Yanwang Chamber of Commerce's sickly scholar has appeared in the Northwest. He entered the city early this morning and is staying at an inn in the city. After he finished talking about Tan Jiji, Zhuo Jing changed the topic and talked about another matter. Sickly scholar was definitely someone that the Prince Ding mansion had to monitor, whether it was his personality or his enmity with the Prince Ding mansion. If it wasn't for Ling Taihan's face and the friendship between Ling Taihan and Su Qingchen, Yili definitely wouldn't mind making the first move and killing this person. Send someone to keep an eye on him and inform Ling Taihan. If he dares to do anything he shouldn't do in Li City, don't blame me for not giving face to the head of the Yanwang Chamber. Zhuo Jing acknowledged and retreated. Yili frowned as she thought about it. It had been more than half a month since the blue sky flower was brought back from the Chu capital. Xinyang and Dr. Lin had been studying it behind closed doors every day and she didn't know when they would receive it. Although she usually couldn't see anything wrong with Mo Xiuyao, Yili still understood that with such a poisonous poison and old injury in his body, Mo Xiuyao definitely wouldn't be comfortable. After thinking about it, Yili got up and walked towards the courtyard where Xinyang and Dr. Lin were staying. As soon as she entered, she heard Xinyang and Dr. Lin quarreling non-stop. Xinyang usually acted like a famous scholar. Even if his mouth was a bit poisonous, he rarely quarreled with others without any grace. Dr. Lin's personality was strange, but after interacting with him for a few months, Yili had never seen him like this. He was just about to roll up his sleeves and fight with someone. Stepping into the courtyard, Yili smiled and said, Mr. Shen, Master, what's wrong with the two of you? Shenyang snorted and raised his chin proudly. This genius doctor doesn't want to lower himself to the same level as a country bumpkin. Dr. Lin didn't hold back and looked at him with disdain. It's a country bumpkin who doesn't want to lower himself to your level. How dare you call yourself a genius doctor when you're so rigid? You've killed many people over the years, right? Shenyang was furious. He jumped up and said angrily, Old man Lin. Don't take advantage of your seniority to think that I don't dare to beat you up. You actually dare to slander this old man's medical ethics. Dr. Lin sneered, Do you think I'm afraid of you? Did the diarrhea yesterday feel good? Yili couldn't help but cover her face and groan. As the saying goes, a mountain can't accommodate two tigers. This courtyard obviously couldn't accommodate two godly doctors. In the beginning, the two of them were chatting as if they wished they could have known each other earlier. How did they end up drugging each other in just a few months? She hurriedly held back the two men who were about to fight. Mr. Shen, be gentlemanly. Master, don't be angry, don't be angry. We can talk this out. Dr. Lin snorted and squinted at Shenyang. For the sake of Princess Ding, this old man won't argue with you. Shenyang snorted even louder than him. He waved his hand and smoothed his sleeves. Recovering his scholarly demeanor, he asked, How does Wang Fei have the time to come here? Yili was speechless. If I didn't come, would you have killed each other? In reality, Yili was worrying too much. In the recent days, the two of them had frequently disagreed. The servants in the courtyard were used to it. When they saw them quarrel, they would immediately hide far away to avoid being caught in the crossfire. Even so, they didn't see anyone kill the other. The three of them sat down. Shenyang looked at Yili and said, This old man understands why Wang Fei has come. Yili nodded with a faint smile and said, Then Mr. Shen and Master must have made some progress. Shenyang and Dr. Lin looked at each other and then talked. The reason they quarreled every day was because they had made some progress. But the two of them couldn't agree and neither could convince the other. The ancient recipe for the Bailuo flower had been lost for almost 1,000 years and the recipe was extremely complicated. There were many places that were written that were wrong. If one place was wrong, the consequences would be unthinkable. Hearing Shenyang's words, Yili was silent for a moment. She also understood that nothing could be solved so easily. Much less an ancient recipe that had been lost for thousands of years. But the Bailuo flower wasn't a medicinal ingredient that could be found anywhere and it wasn't allowed to be tested. What is Mr. Shen and Master's opinion? Hiding the disappointment that flashed through her heart, Yili asked. Shenyang looked admiringly at Yili and said, A more conservative method. Using the Bailuo flower as medicine can temporarily suppress the fire and cold poisons in the prince's body. It can guarantee the prince's safety for many years. Yili shook her head and rejected Shenyang's method. Anyone with eyes could see that the future days wouldn't be peaceful. If something happened to Mo Xiuyao's body, then it would be better to let the Mahist army and the people of the Prince Ding mansion die. Also, where in the world could they find a second Bailuo flower? After thinking for a long time, Yili said, The prince's body is fine for now. Please continue your research. In reality, the two of them also didn't think the conservative method was good, but they didn't dare to take Mo Xiuyao's life as a joke. Hearing Yili say this, they naturally agreed. Leaving Shenyang's courtyard, Yili's mood was a bit gloomy. Strolling along the corridor, Yili suddenly stopped and said in a deep voice, Qin Feng, go invite sickly scholar over. This consort wants to see him. Yes, this subordinate obeys. Sickly scholar's poison skills could be said to be unparalleled in the world, but his martial arts skills weren't as good because of his body. Since Qin Feng knew his specialties and weaknesses, it wasn't difficult for Qi Lin to invite him over as a guest. Third Pavilion Master, long time no see. How have you been? Yili led her people into the parlor and smiled as she looked at the young man sitting in the parlor with a sinister expression on his face. Sickly Scholar heard this and turned around. He narrowed his eyes and stared at the quiet woman in green. His eyes flashed with a malicious light. Cough cough. Princess Ding. It has indeed been a long time. What? Mo Xiaoyao isn't dead yet. Yili wasn't angry and smiled. Third Pavilion Master, thank you for your concern. The prince is fine. Otherwise, why would Pavilion Master go through so much trouble to come to Glass City from Xiling? Sickly Scholar stared at her coldly and said, the Bailuo flower is in your hands. Back then, for the location of the Bailuo flower, he and Yili had a lot of battles of wits and courage. He didn't expect that in the end, the item would fall into Yili's hands first. Yili lowered her eyes and said indifferently, Mo Jingqi or Tan Jiji told you? Sickly Scholar raised his eyebrows. Yili smiled faintly. When Feng San came back from the capital, he told me that he was being chased by people from the Yanwang Chamber of Commerce. This consort guessed that it wouldn't be long before I meet Third Pavilion Master. However, Yili changed the topic and her calm eyes were tinged with a trace of coldness. Third Pavilion Master dared to come to my Glass City alone. Do you not care about this consort and the Prince Ding mansion, or do you think that this consort wouldn't dare to touch you because of Pavilion Master Ling? When Ling Taihan was mentioned, Sickly Scholar's expression turned ugly. He sneered, this young master doesn't need you to care about Big Brother's face. Didn't Princess Ding invite this young master here to make a request of me? I heard that godly Dr. Shen Yang lives in the Prince Ding mansion all year round. How is it? Has he figured out the prescription for the Bailuo flower? Yili's lips curled into a faint smile as she nodded and admitted, Third Pavilion Master is right. This consort did invite Third Pavilion Master here because of the Bailuo flower's prescription. Sickly Scholar's malicious face squeezed out a malicious smile, don't even think about it. You want me to save Mo Xiaoyao? Stop dreaming. When this young master has mastered the Bailuo Huang Quan, I will invite Mo Xiaoyao to have a taste. Chapter 478. Yili sat calmly on the chair and looked at him. Even her eyes did not move. Sickly Scholar looked strangely at Yili and asked, you really are a strange woman. Are you really Mo Xiaoyao's woman? Yili raised an eyebrow and looked in puzzlement at him. Sickly Scholar examined Yili for a moment and then asked, without the ancient recipe for the blue jade falling flower, Mo Xiaoyao would have died without a doubt. Are you not worried at all? Are you not angry at me for saying this? Ah. I remember now. You also heard me say this in Nanjiang. At that time, you did not show any traces. Even Mo Xiaoyao himself is not as calm as you. Hearing this, Yili grimaced inside. How could she be calm? She was pretending that she had no choice but to be calm. In reality, she really wanted to teach the person in front of her a lesson right now. But she could not. Sickly Scholar examined Yili. After a while, he suddenly smiled and said, I have it. If you really want to save Mo Xiaoyao, it is not impossible. Follow me in the future. If you follow me, this master will be more generous and spare Mo Xiaoyao's little life. Yili blinked and asked calmly, follow you? What does Third Pavilion Master want me to do with you? Sickly Scholar looked at her with disdain and sneered, you don't think that this master likes you, right? With your status, it's not bad for you to be a servant girl who serves tea for me. What do you think? Standing behind Yili, Qin Feng's expression changed. He took a step forward and was about to attack. Yili raised a hand to stop him. She looked calmly at Sickly Scholar and said, "Third Pavilion Master, I have a bad habit. If I am not happy, I will make others even more unhappy than me. So, if my husband dies..." Sickly Scholar gave a disdainful smile and said, "Princess, you don't want to say that you want to kill my wife, right?" "I'm very sorry, this master has not married yet." Yili gave a faint smile and continued after being interrupted, "I want other people's entire family to die. Not to mention your family, even if it is someone you know, this consort can kill them all." Shameless boasting. Sickly Scholar's eyes twitched as he said coldly. Did this woman think that the Yanwang Chamber was the #1 assassins organization in the world and that they did not even put the Emperor of Shiling's office in their eyes? Or did he think that he, the third pavilion master of the King of Hell's pavilion, was an inexperienced child who could achieve his goal with just a few words? Yili smiled and said, "Even if third pavilion master doubts my abilities, you shouldn't doubt the abilities of the Black Cloud Cavalry and the Qilin. Or is it that third pavilion master is determined to oppose the Prince Ding mansion for so many years, but you have not even figured out the strength of your opponent? This consort does not understand what kind of deep hatred there is between third pavilion master and our prince that you have to stake it all on one throw. Not to mention anything else, without the falling jade flower, with your distinguished self's current body, who knows when he will die? How will you take revenge? This consort sees that third pavilion master's complexion and body are much worse than when he was in Nanjiang, right? When the time comes, will it be our prince's poison or third pavilion master's illness that acts up first?" Sickly Scholar's expression was twisted as he glared at Yili with a face full of resentment. His life had been full of misfortune since he was young, causing his personality to become twisted, and he would seek revenge for the smallest grievance. There was no deep hatred between him and Mo Xiaoyao, but in this world, he could be ranked in the top 3 of Mo Xiaoyao's people. It was because Mo Xiaoyao's palm had crippled most of his martial arts and damaged his heart meridians, causing his martial arts to stagnate and his body to become sickly. But in the end, it was because the Yanwang Chamber of Commerce had tried to assassinate Mo Xiaoyao first. However, Sickly Scholar hated Mo Xiaoyao from then on. Moreover, he hated him to the bone and he would not rest until he was dead. It was as unreasonable as Han Mingyue falling in love with Su Zuidi. After a while, Sickly Scholar suddenly began to chuckle. After a while, he stopped laughing and raised his chin to look at Yili. "Princess Ding, there is nothing you can say. Even if I die, I will drag Mo Xiaoyao down with me. As for the ancient recipe for the falling jade flower, you don't have to worry about it. No one in this world can solve it. If you accidentally turn the life-saving antidote into a deadly poison, don't blame me for not warning you." Yili quietly looked at him for a while, then slowly smiled. "In that case, third pavilion master can stay in the Prince Ding mansion for the time being. Why don't you see who will live longer, Prince or you? Even if there is no antidote, as long as Prince is alive, he will be able to call the wind and summon the rain. As for you, you will have to lie in bed for half a year. Other than playing with some useless poisons, you are just a useless piece of trash hiding under Pavilion Master Ling's protection." Yili's voice was soft and slow. Even her face had a gentle and refined smile. However, the words that came out of her mouth were like sharp blades that stabbed into Sickly Scholar's heart without hesitation. Sickly Scholar's eyes suddenly widened. He stared at Yili with an indescribably terrifying expression. He suddenly stood up and threw himself at Yili. "Bitch. You're speaking nonsense." However, he didn't even have the chance to touch Yili. A fierce palm wind knocked him out and threw him into a chair to the side. Before he could recover, a cold and harsh voice came from the door. "Sickly Scholar. I think you don't want to be Sickly Scholar, you want to be a dead scholar." The tall man who appeared at the door was dressed in a purple brocade robe with cloud patterns. His white hair was casually tied up, He unconsciously exuded an aura and majesty that surpassed all living beings. Who else could it be but Mo Xiaoyao? Sickly Scholar was sent flying into a chair by this sudden attack. He immediately spat out a mouthful of blood. It was clear that his injuries were not light. However, everyone present knew that Mo Xiaoyao had definitely held back. Otherwise, with Mo Xiaoyao's strength that could cripple most of Sickly Scholar's martial arts and almost break his heart, there was no way that Sickly Scholar would still be breathing after this attack. Mo Xiaoyao stepped into the reception pavilion with a murderous aura. His eyes seemed to freeze over as he stared at Sickly Scholar. Mo Xiaoyao was filled with killing intent towards Sickly Scholar. Sickly Scholar didn't feel the slightest bit of gratitude towards Mo Xiaoyao's mercy. He propped himself up and glared at Mo Xiaoyao with eyes that were about to pop out of their sockets. His gaze was so venomous that it seemed like he couldn't wait to tear the person in front of him to shreds. Although Yili couldn't understand, she couldn't help but admit that there were such people in this world. Even if you accidentally offended them a little, they would hate you so much that they wanted to exterminate your entire family. Sickly Scholar was clearly such a person. Thinking of this, Yili couldn't help but frown slightly. Only Sickly Scholar knew the complete prescription for the falling jade flower. If he really wanted Mo Xiaoyao to die, even if it meant that he would rather die together with Mo Xiaoyao, then things wouldn't be easy to handle. Mo Xiaoyao sat down beside Yili. Looking at Yili's frowning appearance, he reached out and lifted her chin to face him. His hand lightly stroked her willowy eyebrows as he said softly, "Don't worry." Knowing that Mo Xiaoyao didn't want her to worry, Yili smiled slightly and nodded. The warmth and harmony between the two of them pierced Sickly Scholar's eyes. He laughed coldly and said in a shrill voice, "Mo Xiaoyao, your body won't be able to hold on for more than a few months, right? Ha! I think it's better if you let your woman worry a little more, cough cough, when you die, their lives won't be easy." Chapter 479. Third Brother, Shut Up. Before Mo Xiaoyao could fly into a rage, a tall and straight voice came from the door, walking in with a majestic gait. It was the great pavilion lord of the Yanwang Chamber, one of the four great experts, Ling Taihan, whom Yili had met once in Nanjiang. Although Sickly Scholar was arrogant and unruly, he was extremely respectful towards this sworn brother of his. If it was anyone else who had been told to shut up, they would have probably thrown a handful of poisonous sand at him. However, because the person who had come was Ling Taihan, Sickly Scholar obediently swallowed his words even though his expression was gloomy. Ling Taihan first nodded towards Mo Xiaoyao and Yili before walking over to Sickly Scholar's side and taking his pulse. After discovering that the injury wasn't serious, he let out a sigh of relief and cupped his hands towards Mo Xiaoyao. Many thanks to Prince Ding for being lenient. Yili sat beside Mo Xiaoyao and carefully observed this world-famous Yanwang Chamber Lord. Last time in Nanjiang, time was tight and the two of them only exchanged a few words. They didn't have time to observe each other. Ling Taihan was only 35 or 36 years old this year. Because of his exquisite internal strength, he didn't seem to have reached the age of 30. However, his bearing was calm and his actions inadvertently revealed a heroic aura that made people understand that he was indeed a mature middle-aged man. At this point, it could be said that Yili had seen the four great experts of the world. Without mentioning the oldest, Genom of Gojoseon, in Yili's opinion, Genom of Gojoseon was more like a politician and general than a peerless expert. Perhaps it was because of this state of mind that Genom of Gojoseon's martial arts cultivation had been stagnant all these years. Therefore, even though he was older than Mo Xiaoyao and the others by a generation, he was still as famous as them. As for the other expert, Mu Qingsang, his age seemed to be about the same as Ling Taihan's. However, Mu Qingsang was trained to be more like a silent killing machine. He hid in the darkness where no one could see him and consumed his life year after year. Therefore, even though Mu Qingsang's age might not be as old as Ling Taihan, he seemed especially pale and powerless. If the two of them stood together, it would be hard to believe that they were both high-spirited and arrogant in the Jianghu. Of the four great experts, the one that Yi Li was most familiar with was naturally Mo Xiuyao. Even now, Yi Li was not sure how high Mo Xiuyao's martial arts were. However, his reputation as a heavenly genius was undeniable. Mo Xiuwen, Mo Xiuyao's elder brother, was a scholarly general. Although Mo Lufang was both a scholar and a martial artist, he was only at the level of an ordinary expert. The reason why he was able to beat Genom of Gojoseon to the point that he could not retaliate was because he relied on strategizing. Yi Li even suspected that Genom of Gojoseon's martial arts was so high that he was preparing to assassinate Mo Lufang. However, Mo Xiuyao was an exception. When he obtained the title of one of the four great experts, he was only 14 years old. Although he was ranked last, everyone in the world knew that he had just started. Compared to Genom of Gojoseon at his peak, Ling Taihan and Mu Qingsang who were about to step into their peak, Mo Xiuyao could not even be considered to have just started. Such a heavenly genius, it was said that Ling Taihan once said in public that in at most 7 years, Mo Xiuyao would be unrivaled in the world. Unfortunately, the world was unpredictable. After Mo Xiuyao turned 18, his life began to strangely tilt and become silent. After comparing the four great experts, Yi Li felt that Ling Taihan was the true peerless expert in people's hearts. Steady, bold, and measured in his actions. He was more like the righteous Wulin Alliance head of Jianghu and not the assassin leader of the Yanwang Chamber of Commerce who killed people like scything flax. Third brother's health is not good. Can I ask someone to find a doctor first? Ling Taihan glanced at his fierce and unruly adopted brother who could not speak due to his presence. He felt that leaving him here was not a good place to talk, so he asked Mo Xiuyao. Mo Xiuyao lowered his head and looked at Yi Li questioningly. Li Li was the one who invited him, so she naturally had the final say. Yi Li smiled and said, "Of course you can. There are 2 godly doctors in the Prince Ding mansion. If Pavilion Master Ling doesn't mind, you can send 3rd Pavilion Master over." Ling Taihan thanked her and shouted outside. Immediately, 2 young men came in to await his orders. Ling Taihan said, "Take 3rd Pavilion Master to see a doctor. If he escapes, do as you see fit." The 2 young men's expressions were solemn. They naturally understood the Pavilion Master's intentions. The Yanwang Chamber of Commerce's punishments were not for show. Just as the 2 of them were about to ask Sickly Scholar to leave, Sickly Scholar's eyes flashed and he coldly said, "Scram." Third brother. Ling Taihan's expression sank. He looked unhappily at Sickly Scholar's sallow and slightly pale face. Sickly Scholar also knew that his adopted brother was truly angry. However, he had just been hit by Mo Xiuyao and was not lightly injured. Now that he was being suppressed by Ling Taihan, he was filled with anger and frustration that he had no way to vent. He was born with a leftist personality. After being suppressed by Ling Taihan, he did not even care about his older brother, whom he had respected since he was young. He sneered at Ling Taihan and roared, "You don't need to worry about my life or death. Didn't you dislike me for causing trouble? Wouldn't it be better if I died?" Hearing this, Ling Taihan's expression sank. Before he could react, a black shadow flew in from outside. Before the person could stand still, there was a paw sound and a heavy slap landed on Sickly Scholar's face. Sickly Scholar's arrogant glare towards Ling Taihan was immediately slapped to the side. "Impudent! Why haven't you apologized to your older brother yet?" The person's voice was clear but slightly cold. She was dressed in black and her slender figure appeared even more graceful. It was a beautiful woman in her 20s with a face as cold as ice. Yi Li slightly knit her brows. She had an idea of the woman's identity. Yanwang Chamber's second chamber master, Ling Luyue, who was known as Yu Luo Sha in the early years. Ling Luyue's qigong and hidden weapons were unparalleled in the early years of Jianghu. To be able to charge into the palace alone, it seemed that her qigong was not bad. She waved her hand and dismissed the guards who had followed Ling Luyue. After being slapped in the face in front of everyone, the expression on Sickly Scholar's face suddenly changed. The regret that had flashed across his face disappeared without a trace. He gritted his teeth and refused to look at Ling Luyue. Of course, he would not apologize to Ling Taihan. Ling Taihan did not care about this. He let out a sigh of relief at Ling Luyue's arrival and said, "Luyue, take Sandy to see a doctor. Don't let him run around." Ling Luyue nodded. She turned to Mo Xiuyao and Yili and said, "I was anxious, please forgive me." Yili smiled faintly and said, "Second Chamber Master's qigong is extraordinary, this Fei admires it. But in the future, if Chamber Master comes again, it is better to go through the front door. The arrows of the Prince Ding mansion will not always leave the bow." Ling Luyue was stunned. She looked at the smiling Yili and nodded her head, saying, "Thank you for the reminder." Then she turned to Sickly Scholar and said, "Come with me." Sickly Scholar's personality was strange, but he had some feelings for his two sworn brothers and sisters. Previously, he had argued with Ling Taihan in a fit of anger. Now that he had been slapped, he slowly calmed down. Glancing at Yili and Mo Xiuyao who were watching the show, he silently followed Ling Luyue. Although Yili did not show it on the surface, she was actually quite angry at Sickly Scholar. If it was not for the fact that Sickly Scholar had the Yanwang Chamber of Commerce and Ling Taihan behind him, Yili really would have tortured him. At this time, seeing his obedient appearance after being slapped, she felt very happy. She secretly cheered for Ling Luyue's slap, good slap. Chapter 480. Without Sickly Scholar ruining the mood, the atmosphere in the parlor immediately became much better. Ling Taihan looked apologetically at Yili and Mo Xiuyao and cupped his hands. "Third brother is ignorant and has offended you. I hope you can forgive him. Pavilion Master, there's no need to worry. The reason we're keeping your younger brother alive isn't entirely because of Pavilion Master Ling's face," Yili said with a smile. Ling Taihan naturally understood Yili's pride. Of course, they had to give face to the Yanwang Chamber, but the Prince Ding mansion definitely wouldn't be afraid of the Yanwang Chamber. The most important thing was that Sickly Scholar had the complete ancient recipe for the falling sky flower. Ling Taihan smiled bitterly and helplessly. To be honest, this humble one came to the northwest for this matter as well. If Sickly Scholar could obtain information about the falling sky flower from the Prince Ding mansion, then of course Ling Taihan could obtain it as well. However, Ling Taihan was different from Sickly Scholar. He didn't hate Mo Xiuyao, and had no enmity with Mo Xiuyao, nor did he have any interest in Mo Xiuyao. Whether Mo Xiuyao lived or died didn't affect him in the slightest. If Mo Xiuyao really did die at an untimely age, then perhaps he would sigh and say that the heavens were jealous of geniuses. Since both sides needed the falling sky flower to save their lives, and the Prince Ding mansion had the medicinal ingredients, and the Yanwang Chamber had the ancient recipe, why not take a step back and achieve a win-win situation? Compared to his adopted brother's life and health, his adopted brother's inexplicable hatred was even more insignificant in Ling Taihan's eyes. Yili raised her eyebrows and asked, "Does Pavilion Master Ling have the recipe as well?" Ling Taihan shook his head frankly and said seriously, "Princess Ding, please do not worry. I will definitely hand over the recipe. After all, this concerns not only Prince Ding's safety, but also my third brother's life. If Prince Ding really died, even if his third brother did not die of illness, the Prince Ding mansion would not let him go." Yili looked at him with a smile and asked suspiciously, "There's only one Biluo flower." Pavilion Master Ling, have you never thought about what to do if you don't have enough medicine? Ling Taihan smiled and said, "This one doesn't know much about medicine or poison, but since third brother intends to use half of the Biluo flower to concoct medicine and half to concoct poison, it shouldn't be insufficient. Furthermore, I don't necessarily need the falling jade flower. I just hope that third brother's health will improve. Since he was young, he has suffered more than others, so his temperament is a bit strange. Ever since he was injured, he has become more and more withdrawn. It's all thanks to my guidance as his older brother. I hope the two of you can be magnanimous enough to forgive him." Sickly Scholar's problem was not as absolute as Mo Xiuyao's poison. His body was the result of serious injuries. Although the falling jade flower was the best solution, it was not necessarily the only way to save him. With the Prince Ding Mansion's ability, what kind of medicine could they not find and what kind of famous doctor could they not invite? Ling Taihan had wanted to personally go to the Prince Ding Mansion to ask Sickly Scholar to treat him. However, Sickly Scholar vehemently opposed it and even ran away from home, so he could only give up. Yili naturally understood Ling Taihan's meaning. She couldn't help but have a better impression of this top assassin in Jianghu. Regardless of what Ling Taihan and the Yanwang Chamber of Commerce were doing, at least Ling Taihan treated Sickly Scholar really well, even though he was not related to him by blood. With Sickly Scholar's personality, he was definitely not someone that people liked. It was not easy for Ling Taihan to be so considerate towards him. Also, with Sickly Scholar's personality and vicious methods, if it wasn't for Ling Taihan suppressing him, he would have caused a lot of trouble in Jianghu. Even if the Yanwang Chamber of Commerce was powerful, Jianghu was filled with crouching tigers and hidden dragons. Who knew when Sickly Scholar would provoke someone that he could not afford to provoke? Pavilion Master Ling is truly a good older brother. In that case, Pavilion Master, Second Pavilion Master, and Third Pavilion Master should stay in Glass City for a while. As for the ancient recipe, there's no need to rush it. It's not that I don't trust Pavilion Master, but it's too important right now. It's better if Third Pavilion Master is willing to take it out. Yili nodded towards Ling Taihan as she spoke. Ling Taihan thought for a moment, then nodded in agreement to Yili's suggestion. He also understood why Yili had such concerns. It was because his third brother's personality was too extreme. Even if he stepped in, his sworn brother might not be able to change his mind. He might risk his life to perish together with Prince Ding. At that time, not only would Prince Ding and his third brother's lives be sacrificed, but the lives of everyone in the Prince Ding Mansion and the Yanwang Chamber of Commerce would also be lost. Ling Taihan also knew a bit about Mo Xiuyao's situation. Seeing that Yili was still so calm at this time, he couldn't help but look at her in a new light. Then I'll have to trouble Princess Consort. After talking about Sickly Scholar's matter and Ling Taihan's departure, Yili got up and left the room for Mo Xiuyao and Ling Taihan to talk. She then got up and went to Shenyang's courtyard. Although the appearance of the Yanwang Chamber's second pavilion master had only been a fleeting one, Yili suddenly felt a trace of curiosity and interest towards this cold woman. Only Mo Xiuyao and Ling Taihan were left in the reception pavilion. It instantly became quiet. The two men both had extraordinary auras. Mo Xiuyao had more of the noble and domineering aura of someone born in a noble family, while Ling Taihan had more of the carefree and heroic aura of someone from the Jianghu. In terms of appearance, Ling Taihan lost to Mo Xiuyao by a bit. However, Ling Taihan's steady, heroic, and carefree personality made it easier for people to get close to him than Mo Xiuyao. After quietly drinking tea for a while, Ling Taihan finally raised his teacup to Mo Xiuyao and said with a smile, "I've long heard that Princess Ding is one of the most extraordinary women of her time. I've met you once in Nanjiang, but seeing you today, I know that you live up to your reputation." Prince Ding has married a good wife. It's truly a good fortune. Mo Xiuyao nodded without any trace of politeness. Of course Princess Li is a good wife. Pavilion Master Ling didn't come here just for sickly scholar, right? If that's the case, then there's no need. You and I have an agreement. As long as he doesn't really anger me, I won't touch him. Ling Taihan looked at him with a smile and asked suspiciously, why did I feel like Prince Ding wanted to kill him? Mo Xiuyao snorted and said, he wanted to hurt Princess Li. I'll let him live. As for how he would let him live, that was up to him. As long as he had one breath left, it was still considered letting him live. You and I both know that he can't hurt Princess Ding at all. Not to mention Princess Ding's skills, the guard standing behind Princess Ding wasn't someone to be trifled with either. Based on his third brother's skills that were equivalent to half a cripple without poison, wanting to harm Ding Wangfei was just wishful thinking. However, Ling Taihan didn't plan on arguing with Mo Xiuyao about this. If he wanted to avenge his beloved wife, it was Yanwang Chamber's fault. He couldn't stop him. Otherwise, if he angered Mo Xiuyao, it would only make things worse for his third brother. Letting out a sigh, Ling Taihan stopped thinking about his headache-inducing younger brother and said, didn't you ask me why I came to Glass City? Just now, there was a business deal that came to Yanwang Chamber. Mo Xiuyao frowned, it's related to the Prince Ding mansion. Ling Taihan nodded and said, that's right. Although Yanwang Chamber has already said that they won't accept any business related to the Prince Ding mansion, the other party didn't want to assassinate anyone from the Prince Ding mansion this time. Also, the price they offered was very tempting. Mo Xiuyao raised his eyebrows and looked at him with an indifferent expression. Yanwang Chamber was in the business of killing people. If they didn't kill people, why would they look for them? If it was something else, there would naturally be people who could do it better than them. Ling Taihan smiled and said, I've already accepted it. Chapter 481. Mo Xiuyao looked at him calmly. Ling Taihan could only sigh helplessly. He said seriously, didn't you fight with Lei Jinting a few days ago? The other side wants me to fight with you again. If it weren't for the fact that they couldn't find Mu Qingcang, they would have even asked him to fight with you. Reason? Mo Xiuyao asked. Ling Taihan shook his head and frowned, I've thought about it a few times these past few days. When you and Lei Jinting fought, neither of you used your full strength. That's why you both managed to escape unscathed. If you and I really fought, it would have been a lose-lose situation. However, after more than 10 years, I'm still looking forward to sparring with Prince Ding again. More than 10 years ago, Ling Taihan was only a young man in his early 20s. He was in high spirits at that time. Although Genom of Gojoseon was famous, he was still much older than them. The only person in the world who could compare to him was Mu Qingcang. Who knew that at that time, the 14-year-old Mo Xiuyao, dressed in white, would appear on a horse with a sword? Who knew how many people were stunned by the sword competition that year? Although Ling Taihan didn't lose, Ling Taihan didn't think that he would win by a single move against a 14-year-old youth. The result was almost a draw. At that time, Ling Taihan and Mo Xiuyao agreed to fight again 5 years later. After that, he went into seclusion in the Yanwang Chamber of Commerce. Who knew that after 5 years, the first news he received was that his third brother had recklessly gone to find trouble with Mo Xiuyao. At the same time, he also learned that Mo Xiuyao was seriously injured and crippled. At that time, Ling Taihan's feelings were even more complicated than when he had sparred with Mo Xiuyao. It was as if you had worked hard for 5 years and thought you could finally kill your enemy, only to be told that your enemy had just killed you yesterday. You really want to fight? Mo Xiuyao asked. Ling Taihan laughed and said, why not? Or is your body still not fully recovered? In that case, it wouldn't be too late to fight after the falling jade flower was refined. I just forgot to confirm the date of the duel with him. The only reason he accepted the challenge was because he wanted to spar with Mo Xiuyao. Therefore, the time and place would naturally be decided by him and Mo Xiuyao. So many years had passed, and the so-called four great masters of the world had gone about their own business. There was almost no chance for them to meet, and this made Ling Taihan feel depressed for a long time. He needed to spar with experts of the same level to improve his martial skills. And among them, Mo Xiuyao was undoubtedly the best opponent. As for Genom of Gojoseon, after hearing about the duel between Mo Xiuyao and Genom of Gojoseon, Ling Taihan had already lost interest in his martial arts. Genom of Gojoseon's martial arts were clearly still at the level of 10 years ago. If he used his full strength, Ling Taihan felt that he had at least an 80% chance of winning. As soon as he walked into Shenyang's courtyard, he heard the sound of an intense argument. It didn't sound like the usual Shenyang and Dr. Lin who would fight at the slightest disagreement. Instead, it sounded like all sorts of vicious and contemptuous taunts. Even Yili, who was standing at the door, couldn't help but twitch her mouth when she heard it. They didn't even enter the room. The two who were like fire and water last time were now united against outsiders. Shenyang sat to one side and leisurely sipped his tea, looking like a distinguished scholar. Dr. Lin was also drinking tea at the side, looking at the people in front of him with disdain. Zhuo Jing, who had brought Lang Luyue and sickly scholar over, could only persuade them, "Sirs, it was Wang Fei who asked you to take a look at this person." Dr. Lin snorted softly and glanced at Zhuo Jing, saying, "How come this old man doesn't remember saying that I will only listen to your Wang Fei's orders? She said to take a look, so I'll take a look." Shenyang smiled and said, "This one may be receiving a salary from the Prince Ding mansion, but, as a divine doctor with self-respect, this one will definitely not take a look at someone of the same profession." These words were clearly to Dr. Lin's liking. Dr. Lin nodded and said, "Speaking of which, this old man had a nickname in the Jianghu in the past. It was called seeing death but not saving. The meaning is, I won't save those who shouldn't die, and I won't save those who should die." When Dr. Lin first exclaimed that he was going to bed, it was at least 30 years ago. He was older than everyone present. Naturally, they didn't care whether what he said was true or not. Instead, they clearly expressed their position. Sickly scholar kept coughing. It was unknown whether it was because he was angry or because his injuries were too serious. When he finally recovered, he pulled Lang Luyue and said, "Second sister, let's go." After saying this, his gaze swept over Shenyang and Dr. Lin like it was dipped in poison. He was thinking that when he recovered, he would come back and poison these two old farts to death. Shenyang and Dr. Lin naturally saw his gaze and expression. However, if it was someone else, they might be afraid of sickly scholar's superb poison skills and the poison that was difficult to cure. However, these two people could be said to be the top doctors of their time. Unless the sickly scholar really had the ability to concoct a poison that had been lost since ancient times, there really weren't many poisons that could scare them. Lang Luyue was different from sickly scholar. She had also heard of Shenyang's name. The Yanwang Chamber of Commerce was a place where all kinds of strange people gathered. Lang Luyue naturally understood that most of the people with abilities had strange temperaments. She faintly looked at sickly scholar and cupped her hands. "Third brother was rude, please forgive the two doctors." Hearing Lang Luyue's words, Yili understood that it was most likely sickly scholar who provoked them first. After all, although Shenyang and Dr. Lin quarreled every day, they had never had any disputes with unrelated people. It was impossible for them to make things difficult for someone who came to seek treatment for no reason. Moreover, it was someone she asked to come over. Seeing this, Yili was no longer in a hurry to mediate. She leaned against the wall and thought. Seeing that Imo Xiaoyao and Ling Taihan's friendship was not ordinary, Sickly Scholar probably couldn't kill him. She had to find a chance to teach him a lesson to vent her anger. Second sister, you don't have to beg these two damn old men. With their little ability, they can't even come up with a prescription. What ability do they have to treat me? Sickly Scholar said disdainfully. Shut up. Ling Luiyue frowned and snapped, one more word and I'll have Big Brother lock you up in the forbidden area and never come out again. Sickly Scholar was startled. Looking at the beautiful and cold woman in black in front of him, a trace of sadness flashed in his eyes. On the other side, Dr. Lin chuckled and said to Sickly Scholar, you speak as if you were the one who came up with that prescription. The ancient prescription that Xinyang knew of was basically just a legend. In his library, there was only half a prescription and it was a remnant from 1,000 years ago. Not only were the words different, but the names of the herbs were also different. Even the meanings were written differently. Unless he had the complete ancient prescription, he really didn't believe that this strange kid in front of him could figure out the prescription himself. Sickly Scholar smiled coldly and kept silent. So what if he didn't come up with it himself? He was lucky enough to get the complete ancient prescription, so he won. If these people wanted to know the ancient prescription, wouldn't they have to beg him? Mr. Shen, Master, what's going on? Seeing that the argument inside was about to end, Yili walked out and asked with a smile as she looked at the people in front of her. Shuojing walked forward and told Yili what had happened. This Sickly Scholar was really asking for a beating. It was probably because he hadn't been able to vent his anger in the parlor earlier and had vented it on Xinyang and Dr. Lin. But which one of these two people was easy to get along with? Sickly Scholar almost spat out blood after hearing this. Xinyang smiled and didn't say anything. Dr. Lin wasn't so polite and snorted, where did you find such a vicious and sickly person? He's about to die and he still doesn't know his place. Yili raised her eyebrows slightly and looked at Sickly Scholar and Ling Luiyue. As long as she saw Sickly Scholar, he would always look sickly. So even after being hit by Imo Xiaoyao, he still looked sickly and didn't look like he was about to die. It was Ling Luiyue who frowned and looked worriedly at her adopted brother. My adopted brother doesn't know any better and has offended the two of you. I hope the two of you can save his life on account of his youth and ignorance. Chapter 482. Dr. Lin narrowed his eyes at Ling Luiyue and said, You're more honest than that girl, but your brother, he's so mischievous. He clearly needs to be taught a lesson. It's better to kill him. Dr. Lin was still brooding over the fact that Yili had lied to him. Yili smiled bitterly in her heart. Ling Luiyue was a famous assassin in the pugilistic world. Master, is there something wrong with your eyes? Ling Luiyue's expression was solemn. Looking at Sickly Scholar's twisted expression, she said helplessly, We siblings have relied on each other since we were young. My younger brother is insensible, and as his elder sister, I've taught him. Please forgive me. After saying that, Ling Luiyue bowed deeply to the two of them. Just as Ling Luiyue said, the three siblings had grown up together. When they first met, the oldest, Ling Taihan, was only 12, she was 9, and the youngest, third brother, was only 5. The three of them had no one to rely on as they wandered the pugilistic world. Later, the three of them were taken into the Yanwang chamber. In a place like the Yanwang chamber, only 2 or 3 out of 10 children could survive. It was also Ling Taihan who protected the two of them. Among them, third brother's martial arts aptitude was the worst. In order to let this little brother survive such a cruel training, she and big brother had put in a lot of effort. But in a place that Ling Luiyue did not know, no one could understand how he grew up to have such a personality. However, no matter what, he had never done anything to betray his sworn brother and sister. In fact, he had always listened to the two of them whenever they talked. Just based on this, the two of them could not ignore him. Second sister. Sickly Scholar glared at Lang Luyue, his face pale. Ever since the three of them took over the Yanwang chamber, his second sister had never been so submissive to anyone. But now, it was all because of him. It was as if he was an insensible little brother who would never grow up. Master Shen, Master. Pavilion Master Ling and Prince can be considered old acquaintances. I hope that the two of you can make an exception, Yili said softly. Shen Yang faintly glanced at Yili and said with a faint smile, Elder Lin isn't wrong. If this brat continued to torment himself, even the emerald falling flower wouldn't be able to save his life. Did he really think that the falling jade flower was an immortal medicine? Did he really think that as long as he had half a breath left, he would still be alive and kicking? Wang Fei, don't even think about the prescription in his hands. I think he clearly doesn't want to live anymore. Maybe he wants to die together with the prince. Hearing this, Sickly Scholar's expression changed slightly. His face was ashen and he didn't say anything. Yili saw this and was secretly surprised. Could it be that Mo Xiaoyao and Sickly Scholar really had some deep-seated hatred? After thinking for a while, Yili said, no matter what, Pavilion Master Ling will be staying in Glass City for a while. We have to give him face. I ask Mr. Shen and Master to put in some effort. Moreover, Yili gave a low laugh and said softly, didn't Mr. Shen say that Prince's illness was very boring because he hadn't seen any difficult illnesses in all these years? Now, does this one count as having a difficult illness? Hearing this, Shen Yang's eyes lit up. Although Sickly Scholar's illness and Prince's poison were completely different concepts, there were still some areas where they could be studied together. Of course, he couldn't use Mo Xiaoyao to study, so he will obediently let this old man take a look. Yili didn't hide this from Lang Luyue and Sickly Scholar. Without waiting for Sickly Scholar to reply, Lang Luyue answered first, Mr. Shen, don't worry. I guarantee that he will be obedient. Yili gave a faint smile as she looked at Sickly Scholar who wanted to object but didn't say anything in the end. She blinked her eyes. She seemed to know how to treat this annoying fellow. The three people from the Yanwang Chamber of Commerce stayed in the Prince Ding mansion. With Ling Taihan and Lang Luyue around, Yili didn't have to worry about Sickly Scholar playing any tricks. However, she still ordered Mo Hua to send 20 more shadow guards to stand guard in the main courtyard. Qin Feng also sent 4 of Qi Lin's elites to stand guard in the main courtyard. As long as Sickly Scholar dared to take a step closer to the main courtyard, they would immediately kill him. After all, the others were fine, but Mo Xiaobao was still an infant who didn't have any ability to resist. Naturally, they had to be extra careful. Duel. Hearing Mo Xiaoyao's words, Yili frowned slightly. She put down Mo Xiaobao who was looking around in her arms. Why would Tower Master Ling want to duel with you? Mo Xiaoya put down the teacup and pulled Yili into his arms. He smiled and said, Li, don't worry. Ling Taihan isn't an idiot. Even if he really wants to duel, he won't make both sides suffer. That wouldn't be good for him. Although the Prince Ding mansion was coveted by various forces, to put it bluntly, the Mahist army didn't really need him, the prince, to lead the charge. Even if Mo Xiaoyao wasn't the #1 expert in the world, as long as he was alive, he was still Prince Ding. The Mahist army was still the Mahist army. However, the Yanwang chamber was different. The Yanwang chamber was an assassin organization. They had countless enemies in Jianghu. If it wasn't for Ling Taihan's martial arts, they wouldn't have been able to live peacefully for so many years. Once Ling Taihan and he were both injured, the enemies in Jianghu would probably immediately attack the Yanwang chamber. Yili leaned in Mo Xiaoyao's arms and thought, who asked Tower Master Ling to deal with you? Genom of Gojosian. The curvy handwriting of the founder of the country was very good. Chapter 483. Mo Xiaoyao stared at the silk for a while, then said with a frown, "This should be a type of writing. I remember that some of the books left behind by the previous dynasty's Emperor Gaozu personally examined would sometimes have these strange symbols left behind in some inconspicuous places. However, most of the time, there would only be a few scattered ones, so they would usually be treated as random markings and ignored. However, the silk in front of them had at least 100 symbols woven into it. Mo Xiaoyao was an extremely intelligent person, so he naturally saw a pattern. At the same time, he was certain that this was a type of writing that they did not understand at all. Yili nodded and smiled. Correct, this really is a type of writing. Yili picked up the brush and ink that had been placed to the side. She looked at the silk in front of her as she absent-mindedly ground the ink. Mo Xiaoyao was silent for a while, then asked, "Li recognizes this type of writing?" Yili smiled and nodded. She raised her head and glanced at him. "I truly do recognize this type of writing. This is a type of writing from the extreme west, a place even more distant than the countries of the western regions. However, I will not tell you why I know this." The room was silent for a while. Yili did not pay attention to him. After grinding the ink, she spread out a roll of paper and began to translate the characters on it. After a while, Mo Xiaoyao suddenly fiercely pulled her into his embrace. Yili stopped writing, but did not turn her head to look at him. She only heard Mo Xiaoyao say in a low voice, "There was once a rumor that the previous dynasty's Emperor Gaozu did not die at all, but suddenly disappeared. That is why his tomb and body could not be found. Li, could it be that you are the same as him?" Hearing this, Yili could not help but smile. She put down the brush and turned her head to look at the man who was staring at her with a serious expression. She raised her head and gently kissed him on the lips. Yili said in a low voice, "Do you know where the previous dynasty's Emperor Gaozu came from?" Mo Xiaoyao shook his head. The previous dynasty's Emperor Gaozu was born in a chaotic era, as if he had come out of nowhere. No one knew of his past, his family, or even his parents. His background was the same as his early life, which was why he became one of the most mysterious emperors in history. Yili laughed and said, "Then Prince, do you know where I come from, and which family I come from?" Mo Xiaoyao looked deeply at the smiling woman in front of him. Yes, his Li was different from that emperor. Li was the daughter of the Yi family. Her mother was born in the Su family of Yunzhou. Yili sighed and leaned into his embrace. She smiled and said, "My family, my husband, and my children are all here. Where can I go?" Yili didn't have anything important to do, so she turned her attention to the Bailuo flower. The first thing she wanted to do was naturally to deal with Sickly Scholar, the bastard who deserved a beating. After breakfast, Yili went to visit the courtyard where the people of Yanwang Chamber were staying. Ling Taihan and Lang Luiyue were currently sparring. Sickly Scholar sat alone at the side and stared fixedly at his brother and sister who were flying and dodging around in the garden. His expression was gloomy, and his hand that was holding onto the chair gripped the armrest tightly, as if he wanted to scratch a few marks on the mahogany chair. Yili smiled as she walked to Sickly Scholar's side. She casually smiled and said, "I've long heard that although Pavilion Master Lang is a woman, she is also one of the top experts in the Jianghu. Looking at it now, you and Pavilion Master Ling are indeed a good couple." Sickly Scholar's facial muscles twitched. He raised his head and looked at Yili darkly. Because of Yili's profession in her previous life, what kind of evil and perverted person hadn't she seen before? Sickly Scholar's bit of skill wasn't enough for her to take him seriously. She smiled as she looked at Sickly Scholar and said, "Speaking of which, it's strange. Pavilion Master Ling should be in her early 30s this year, right? A girl at this age who hasn't married yet. Pavilion Master Ling is really holding her back. Later, I should mention this to my prince and ask him to remind Pavilion Master Ling, third Pavilion Master, don't you think so? Yi Li. Sickly Scholar gritted his teeth. What followed was another earth-shaking cough. When he took his hand away, his palm was stained with blood. On the other side, Ling Taihan and Lang Luiyue naturally heard the commotion. They quickly stopped the fight and rushed back. Third brother, what's wrong? Ling Taihan asked in a deep voice. Sickly Scholar didn't appreciate it. He raised his head and looked hatefully at Ling Taihan before returning to his room. Ling Taihan frowned and said to Lang Luiyue, Luiyue, go take a look at him. Lang Luiyue nodded silently. She put away the pair of short thorns in her hands and turned to enter the room. Ling Taihan casually picked up a towel to wipe his hands. He turned and said to Yi Li, Princess, third brother's health really isn't good. Princess, please have mercy. Yi Li raised an eyebrow and smiled. So Ling Taihan had seen that Sickly Scholar had suddenly coughed up blood because of her anger. Yi Li didn't refuse. She waved her sleeve and sat down across from Ling Taihan. She said with a smile, Pavilion Master Ling, even if third Pavilion Master is your relative, you can't be too biased. This consort was also angered by third Pavilion Master yesterday. If I can't vent this anger, this consort won't be able to eat or sleep well. Ling Taihan was helpless. His own sworn brother's mouth wasn't something an outsider could say. Even he, as the older brother, sometimes wanted to give him a good beating. Looking at Yi Li and sighing, Ling Taihan said, Is Princess wondering why this one keeps protecting third brother? Chapter 484. Yi Li nodded slightly. She was indeed a little curious. With Ling Taihan's personality and temperament, he shouldn't like someone as stubborn and ruthless as Sickly Scholar. It wasn't that Ling Taihan was merciful, but even though Ling Taihan was the king of Hell's Pavilion Lord, he was much more open and upright than those righteous people who acted like thieves and prostitutes in the dark. Such a person definitely wouldn't like someone with a twisted mind. Ling Taihan sighed with some regret, I've known my two younger siblings since childhood. Although my third brother was taciturn when he was young, he wasn't like this. At that time, we were still children, and we didn't have any skills. Naturally, we suffered a lot. One year, Lu Yu was seriously ill, and we spent all our savings, but how could that little savings be enough to treat the illness? In order to save Lu Yu, the third brother sold himself and left with the others, leaving behind only the money. After Lu Yu recovered, we joined the Yanwang chamber. Lu Yu practiced martial arts day and night in the hope that one day he would be able to find my third brother. By the time I found my third brother, it was already more than a year later. No one knew how much he had suffered during that time. When we found him, he was seriously injured and almost dying. My third brother's aptitude wasn't good. Even if he practiced martial arts, he wouldn't be able to reach the level of Lu Yu and I. He wasn't suitable for a place like the Yanwang chamber. After he recovered, Lu Yu and I hoped that he would live a peaceful life like an ordinary person. With Lu Yu and I looking after him, he wouldn't be bullied. But who knew that he... Ling Taihan smiled bitterly, he didn't listen to our advice at all. In the end, he joined the Yanwang chamber by himself. With his aptitude, if he practiced martial arts, he would at most become a second-rate assassin in the Yanwang chamber. Most of the time, he would be used as cannon fodder. So he took another path and specialized in poison, which made him a top assassin in the Yanwang chamber. Although he was ruthless to outsiders, he was extremely good to his own people. Although she was an assassin, Moonflow was still a woman. Sometimes, she would be soft-hearted. Every time, third brother would take the initiative to help Lu Yu accept some business that she couldn't do. Yili quietly listened to Ling Taihan's words. She didn't expect that the three leaders of the Yanwang Chamber of Commerce, the most feared organization in Jianghu, had such a past. However, it made sense. After all, innate perverts were in the minority. Sickly scholars' mental illness wasn't cultivated in a day. Pavilion Master Ling and Pavilion Master Lang are tolerating him because you feel sorry for him. Ling Taihan remained silent. Clearly, he agreed with Yi Li's words. At that time, Ling Taihan was still young and full of vigor. Moreover, he lived in a place like the King of Hell's Pavilion. Therefore, he spent most of his energy on improving his martial arts. By the time he came back to his senses, his sworn younger brother had already become a frightening poison master in Jianghu. Yi Li looked thoughtfully at Ling Taihan and asked, speaking of the three pavilion masters, even third pavilion master should be close to 30 this year, but you haven't married yet. Why is that? Ling Taihan looked down thoughtfully. After a while, he sighed and said, this one is focused on martial arts. I really don't have any thoughts of marrying. Moreover, the Yanwang Chamber of Commerce is in the business of killing people. Those who kill will be killed by others. It's better not to have any family. But, after hearing what Wang Fei said today, this one just remembered that it delayed Lu Yu and third brother. Yi Li couldn't help but frown. She looked closely at Ling Taihan's calm and vexed expression. It seemed that Ling Taihan really didn't have any feelings for Ling Luyue. It was certain that sickly scholar had a crush on Ling Luyue. If Ling Taihan didn't have any feelings for Ling Luyue, then this matter would be much easier to handle. But she didn't know what Ling Luyue was thinking. Even if a woman was an assassin, she shouldn't be over 30 and still not have a sweetheart, right? The only men close to Ling Luyue were sickly scholar and Ling Taihan. If Yi Li had to choose, Yi Li felt that she couldn't abandon Ling Taihan and like sickly scholar. Pavilion Master Ling knows why this Fei has come. Yi Li asked softly. Ling Taihan nodded and said, of course. Over the next 2 days, Luyue and I will try our best to persuade third brother to give up the prescription. After all, this is a matter that benefits both sides, there is no need to make it so that both sides suffer. Then, Pavilion Master Ling, please answer this Fei's question. Yi Li said. Ling Taihan was startled and a bit surprised, but he still nodded and said, I will tell you everything I know. Yi Li looked down and asked in a low voice, what does Pavilion Master Ling think of Pavilion Master Ling? Ling Taihan frowned and said, of course I think of Luyue as my younger sister. Ling Taihan reacted very quickly and immediately understood what Yi Li meant. His calm and handsome face showed surprise as he said, Princess's meaning is. Yi Li smiled faintly and was about to nod when she heard the sound of clothes fluttering behind her. The two of them turned around at the same time and saw Ling Luyue's black figure walking away. Yi Li looked helplessly at Ling Taihan and gave a bitter smile. It seemed that Ling Luyue had heard their conversation. More importantly, Ling Luyue really did have feelings for Ling Taihan, so she had left in sadness after hearing Ling Taihan's words. Pavilion Master Lang is not familiar with Glass City, so Pavilion Master Ling should go take a look first. Don't let anything happen. Ling Taihan also knew that Glass City was not like other places. The Prince Ding Mansion's Shadow Guard, the Mahist Army's Black Cloud Cavalry, and the mysterious Qi Lin were all gathered around the city. If Ling Luyue really caused any trouble, she would not be able to escape unscathed. Nodding, Ling Taihan got up and chased after Ling Luyue. Looking in the direction that Ling Taihan's figure had disappeared in, Yi Li's warm smile faded and her beautiful face was gradually dyed with a layer of coldness. Originally, she should not interfere with the emotional entanglements of the Yanwang Chamber of Commerce, but if this was Sickly Scholar's only weakness, she did not mind using his feelings for Lang Luiyue to achieve her goal. Standing up, Yili slowly walked towards the room that Sickly Scholar was resting in. Before she walked in, she heard intermittent coughing coming from inside. Shen Yang and Dr. Lin were right. Sickly Scholar's illness was beyond cure. Pushing open the door and going in, the person inside heard the sound of the door opening and suddenly turned around. But when he saw that the person at the door was Yili, his eyes gradually dimmed. "What are you doing here?" As the Wang Fei, you don't even know to report before entering someone's room? Yili did not care about his rudeness. She walked into the room with a smile and sat down in a chair not far from his bed. She said with a faint smile, "Just now, I was talking to Pavilion Master Ling and was not paying attention, so Pavilion Master Lang heard it." Then Pavilion Master Lang ran out by herself. "What are you talking about?" A trace of worry flashed through Sickly Scholar's eyes as he angrily shouted at Yili. Yili blinked and said with a smile, "Nothing. We were just talking about how Pavilion Master Ling said that he treated Pavilion Master Lang as his own little sister. Is there a problem?" Sickly Scholar stilled. For once, he did not spit venom at Yili and lowered his head in silence. Seeing that Sickly Scholar did not speak, Yili's lips hooked in a faint smile. She said with a serious expression, "Third Pavilion Master, in this world, there is no such thing as having the best of both worlds. The key is the choice of the person. Compared to spending the rest of your life with the person you truly love, is it really that important to fight with my prince? If it is said that my Wang Ye and you have some enmity for the destruction of your family, then it is fine. But from what I know, other than that fight a few years ago, you and my Wang Ye do not have any other contact. Even the family that you were born in does not have any grudges with Ding Wangfu. Why do you have to be like this? Take a step back and you will see the world." This phrase is sometimes reasonable. What do you think? Chapter 485. Sickly Scholar suddenly raised his head and glared fiercely at Yili. The expression on his face changed unpredictably. There was anger at being seen through by Yili, hatred and unwillingness towards Mo Xiuyao, as well as an indescribable sense of inferiority and sadness. "You make it sound so nice, but don't you just want the prescription?" Yili nodded in agreement and said with a smile, "I'm naturally saying this for the prescription and for my husband's life. Could it be that I'm trying to be a matchmaker for Third Pavilion Master? It's not like I have nothing better to do. With the prescription, I'll be happy if my prince can keep his life. Now that you've recovered, whether or not you want to pursue Pavilion Master Lang is your own business. Speaking of which, if Second Pavilion Master really ends up in Third Pavilion Master's hands in the future, this consort will feel guilty." From Yili's point of view, the strange Sickly Scholar was not worthy of Lang Luiyue at all. So she could only use Lang Luiyue as an opening to talk to Sickly Scholar and would definitely not help him pursue Lang Luiyue. Of course, a woman like Lang Luiyue would definitely have a firm heart. If Sickly Scholar was unable to move her, then other people's ideas might not work. Sickly Scholar hated it the most when people said that he wasn't worthy of Lang Luiyue. Although he knew in his heart that he wasn't worthy of his adopted sister, he couldn't allow others to say it. Yili saw that she had said enough, so she got up and prepared to leave. "Third Pavilion Master, think about it carefully. Do you want to try keeping your life, or do you want to gamble with my prince and see who has a harder life? I promise that I will find a suitable husband for Pavilion Master Lang before you die." Leaning against the bed, Sickly Scholar coughed violently as he watched Yili leave without any hesitation. "Yili, you're ruthless enough." Yili had indeed grasped his Achilles heel. He was never a gentleman, and if he really had to watch Lang Luiyue marry someone else, it would be worse than letting him die. No one knew what Ling Taihan and Leng Luyue had talked about. Later that night, the two of them returned to the Prince Ding mansion as if nothing had happened. After dinner, Yi Li and Su Qingchen had a rare moment of leisure as they played chess and chatted. Sickly Scholar asked the guards in the courtyard to deliver a piece of cloth that was filled with ancient handwriting. It was made of an unknown material. Yi Li unfolded it and a satisfied smile appeared on her face. She handed the cloth to Qin Feng behind her and instructed him to personally deliver it to Shenyang and Dr. Lin's courtyard. Yi Li looked more relaxed now that she had finally resolved the matter that had been weighing on her mind for a long time. Su Qingchen pondered as he fiddled with a chess piece and said, "You've obtained the prescription for the Bailuo flower. Why are you so happy?" Yi Li smiled and said, "Of course I'm happy. Is Big Brother not happy?" Su Qingchen shook his head and said with a smile, "A grown woman cannot be kept at home." Yi Li was embarrassed by his words. She had already been married for more than 2 years. Su Qingchen put down a chess piece indifferently and said with a smile, "You deliberately stirred up the emotional entanglements between Ling Taihan and his 2 siblings to force Sickly Scholar to submit. Ling Taihan is still upset and has not reacted yet. When he comes back to his senses, he will make trouble for you." Yi Li did not care at all. She raised her hand and put down a chess piece to swallow a few of Su Qingchen's white pieces and said, "Ling Taihan has the nerve to make trouble for me. That pavilion master Lang is already over 30 years old. She has spent her entire youth on him. He should give someone an explanation, right?" Su Qingchen's hand that was holding the chess piece paused for a moment. He looked at her with a smile and said, "Why do I feel like you're implying something?" Yi Li immediately felt a chill down her spine when Su Qingchen stared at her with a smile that was not a smile. However, she still maintained her composure and said, "Is it wrong? In this world, what kind of good family can a woman over 30 find?" Regardless of whether Ling Taihan knows or not, as her big brother, he allowed his adopted sister to be over 30 years old without even asking about her marriage. Isn't that too unreasonable? To put it nicely, Pavilion Master Ling is obsessed with martial arts and is not disturbed by external matters. To put it bluntly, he is a scum who has ruined a woman's life. Scum. Su Qingchen's smile deepened. "Little sister Li, if you have anything else to say to your big brother, you can say it all." Yi Li sweated and scolded herself in her heart for being so disappointing. She did not know why she was so afraid of Su Qingchen and not Su Qingze, who had been even more serious since childhood. Of course, this was not just Yi Li's fault. In fact, the 3 brothers of the Su family were more afraid of the gentle and refined Su Qingchen. "I'm not talking about you, big brother. Big brother, don't take it personally." Su Qingchen nodded. Seeing Yi Li's rare guilty look, he sighed helplessly and asked, "Did Princess Anxi come to see you?" Yi Li was a bit embarrassed. Su Qingchen's love life was not something she should care about. "Princess Anxi didn't say anything about you, but..." Princess Anxi was the princess of a country and the crown princess. The people of Nanzhao were completely different from the culture of the Central Plains. They had no interest in the so-called imperial jade seal, but they still stayed in Glass City for a long time. How could Yi Li not know why? Although Su Qingchen did not hide from Princess Anxi, he was busy with the affairs in the northwest and did not have much time to accompany her. Every time Princess Anxi came to see Yi Li, she looked like she wanted to say something but hesitated. Yi Li sympathized with her. "Big brother, what do you think of Princess Anxi? Second brother is about to get married. Uncle and aunt should have urged you, right?" After thinking for a while, Yi Li decided to ask Su Qingchen's opinion. Not only because of Princess Anxi, but also because of eldest aunt, grandfather, and uncle, who had always hoped that big brother would get married soon. Princess Anxi is not young anymore. No matter what you think, you should tell her clearly. Su Qingchen nodded and said, I know. I will take care of it. Big brother, you, Anshi and I are not suitable. Su Qingchen smiled calmly and said, she is the crown princess of Nanjiang. One day, she will inherit the throne of Nanzhao. Yili frowned. She was not sure whether Su Qingchen meant it or not. What if Princess Anshi is willing to give up the throne of Nanzhao? We are just friends. Just friends. Su Qingchen's refusal was clear in this short sentence. Yili could only sigh regretfully in her heart. It seemed that Big Brother and Princess Anshi were not destined to be together. Yili threw down the chess piece in her hand and looked at Su Qingchen, saying, in that case, I won't talk about this with you. But, if you really don't have this idea, you should tell Princess Anshi clearly as soon as possible. Su Qingchen nodded and said, I know. What else do you want to say? Yili looked at Su Qingchen seriously and asked, Big brother and uncle, do you have any misgivings about the prince and the Prince Ding mansion? Su Qingchen was startled. He also put down the chess piece in his hand and looked at Yili, asking, why do you think so? Yili pursed her lips and smiled, saying, Big brother, I grew up in the Su family. When I was young, eldest uncle and big brother taught me a lot. Both eldest uncle and eldest brother are talented people. It is rare to have one of them in the world. And the Su family is lucky to have two of them. These days, eldest brother and uncle have worked hard on many things in the Northwest. But, with uncle and eldest brother's abilities, you don't have to work so hard, do you? Su Qingchen lowered his eyes and smiled faintly, saying, is it Prince Ding's idea? Chapter 486. Yili shook her head and said, how can Prince not see through something that even can see? But he didn't say anything. Big brother and uncle are so restrained because you don't trust Prince and the Prince Ding mansion. Su Qingchen was silent for a moment, then shook his head and said, no, I'm just a little tired. Tired? Yili didn't understand. Su Qingchen smiled and said, no matter how much bitterness the Su family has suffered these years, Yunzhou's Su family has been the head of scholars for hundreds of years. The Su family has been able to stand after 2 dynasties because these generations of Su family members trembled in fear. It's lonely at the top. If the Su family doesn't want their descendants to be like us, then, the Su family's reputation gradually fading is the best choice. Yili lowered her head, Big brother, you don't trust Su Qingchen shook his head, no, Big brother isn't awake. But it's not that you don't trust Prince Ding. But what happened after you and Prince Ding? How will your descendants face the Su family? After 3 dynasties, 2 of them succeeded the emperor. No one would trust such a family, and who wouldn't worry? How deep was the brotherhood between Emperor Taizu and the first-generation Prince Ding? How did it end now? Big brother. Yili sighed. How could she not know the Su family's difficult situation? Once the Mahist army really fought for the world and finally established the Central Plains, then the Su family would be the greatest contributor to the founding of the country. A family that has been able to stand after 3 dynasties. A family that betrayed the previous dynasty to support the Dechu state, and betrayed the Dechu state to support Prince Ding, even if they had the reputation of being the head of the world's righteousness, they couldn't completely eliminate the suspicion of the world's people and the king. Su Qingchen looked at her with a smile and said, don't worry. The Su family will still stay in the Northwest to support Prince Ding until Prince Ding doesn't need to know. Yili frowned and said, Big brother, you mean to be a strategist? That's right. Su Qingchen nodded with a smile. No. Yili flatly refused. Big brother, you should know that the strategists of the past dynasties never have a good ending. The so-called strategists were hidden in the dark to give advice to the monarch. Because they knew too many secrets, they were the type to hide the bow after the birds were done. Even the ministers and generals around the monarch would not have a good impression of such people. Wisdom was doubted, incompetence was abandoned. If such a status was imposed on her elder brother and uncle, Yili would rather they live in seclusion in the mountains and not care about worldly affairs. Su Qingchen raised her eyebrows and said with a smile, "Could it be that Li thinks that Prince Ding is someone who would cast aside the bow after the birds are done?" Yili shook her head and said firmly, "In any case, it won't work. Big brother, if you and uncle believe in Li you can stay in the northwest with peace of mind." No matter what happened in the future, Li was willing to guarantee with her life that she would definitely let the Su family retreat in one piece. "If big brother and uncle don't believe me, Li will go and beg the prince to let the Su clan go into seclusion." Li Yili shook her head and looked at Su Qingchen with bright eyes. "Li knows that big brother and uncle are thinking for Li. If the prince relies too much on the Su family, the old officials of the Prince Ding mansion will definitely be dissatisfied with Li. However, Li will never let uncle and big brother suffer such grievances. Big brother and uncle are geniuses in governing the world, not strategists who hide in the dark and specialize in scheming. Li is right." Before Su Qingchen could answer, Mo Xiaoyao's voice of approval came from behind. The two turned around and saw Mo Xiaoyao strolling over, his white hair fluttering slightly against his body. Su Qingchen was just about to stand up, but Mo Xiaoyao was already in front of him. He raised a hand and pressed him back down, smiling as he said, "I didn't think that Big Brother and Big Li would be chatting here. It just so happens that I also wanted to chat with Big Brother, so I came to join in the fun." "Big Brother, you don't mind, right?" The consecutive "Big Brother" made Su Qingchen's mouth twitch. In the past, Mo Xiaoyao would rather die than call him Big Brother. Su Qingchen raised his head and smiled faintly. "Prince, please sit." Mo Xiaoyao sat down next to Yili and looked at Su Qingchen seriously. "I don't dare to guarantee the Su family's prosperity for 100 years, but as Lili said, I can guarantee that the Su family will retreat in one piece for as long as I live. Does Big Brother believe me?" Su Qingchen was silent for a while, then raised his head and smiled. "Prince's words carry enormous weight, how could this one not believe? However, Big Brother, you can forget about calling me that. Prince can just call me by my name." Mo Xiaoyao raised his eyebrows. Su Qingchen shook his head and smiled, "Separating public from private matters, whether it's for Prince Li, or a fake, it's good." Mo Xiaoyao immediately understood Su Qingchen's meaning and nodded. "I will use tea in place of wine to toast young Master Qingchen." "Many thanks." With the prescription provided by sickly scholar, Shen Yang and Dr. Lin were able to produce twice the result with half the effort. Of course, Shen Yang and Dr. Lin had carefully verified that the prescription provided by the sick scholar was indeed an ancient prescription passed down from 1,000 years ago. The two of them had also used various methods and their own knowledge of pharmacology to determine the authenticity of the prescription and the final effect of the medicine they had concocted. From start to finish, they used a full half a month to finally refine what might be the last remaining blue sky flower in the world into a pill and deliver it to Yili and Mo Xiaoyao. The size of the blue sky flower was not small, and in addition to all kinds of precious herbs, it was impossible to count. But in the end, only a mere 5 pills were refined. Once it was confirmed that the blue sky flower was extinct, then the 5 pills in front of them could be said to be the only ones left in the world. Looking at the fragrant dark brown pills in front of them, everyone's faces could not help but be dyed with joy. Shen Yang had a faint smile on his face as he said, "Prince can take 1 pill first, then take another 3 days later. The poison in his body will be completely neutralized. As for this sickly boy, his body can't take it, so he can only take a quarter of the pill each time. He can only take 1 pill every 5 days. You only need 1 pill. After that, you just need to find a famous doctor to nurse your body back to health. Sickly Scholar looked at him coldly and said, "There are 5 pills in total, and you're only giving me 1. Dr. Lin sneered and said, "We only need 2. Why don't we give the rest to you, and you can try taking 1 pill each time like Prince Ding. Your body is weak, and you're blaming the doctor for using too little medicine." He was clearly saying that Sickly Scholar's body was too weak and could not take the medicine. Using too much medicine was indeed effective, but Sickly Scholar's body could not take it. Ling Taihan reached out and patted Sickly Scholar's shoulder. He put away the bottle of medicine that Shenyang handed over and said with a smile, "Many thanks to Mr. Shen and Dr. Lin. I've troubled the 2 of you." The 2 godly doctors' expressions became slightly better. Dr. Lin casually threw out 2 prescriptions and said, "Use these 2 prescriptions as you see fit. You should be fine after a year or so. You need to pay attention to your health and mind, otherwise it will inevitably leave behind side effects." Ling Taihan carefully put away the prescription, and thanked Dr. Lin seriously. Sickly Scholar did not say anything, but after hearing Dr. Lin's words, the light in his eyes could not help but brighten. The medicine refined by the 2 godly doctors was indeed very effective. Mo Xiuyao only used 1 pill, and the poison in his body had already been reduced by more than half. His complexion did not look as pale as before, and even his usual cold body temperature was somewhat normal. Presumably, after the poison was completely removed, Mo Xiuyao's body would be able to fully recover after a year or so of recuperation. However, ever since the poison was removed, Mo Xiuyao's leg, which had been healed for more than a year, began to ache again. This made Yi Li have no choice but to pull Mo Xiuyao to Shenyang's side to examine him. Shenyang was obviously not surprised by this situation. He stroked his beautiful beard and said, "Last year, this one said that the reason why Prince could walk freely was because of the phoenix tail grass. The phoenix tail grass is a fire poison, and its heat is comparable to the cold poison in the cold pond. It was also this fire poison that temporarily broke through the meridians in Prince's legs that were originally blocked due to his serious injuries. Now that the poison in Prince's body has been removed, the original leg injury will naturally relapse.